Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. At the school where I studied in Brooklyn, the Day of the Dead always had a special purpose, honoring those who had already departed. When my teacher announced that each student would create an altar to remember their loved ones, I felt a mixture of anxiety and sadness. While my classmates became excited with the idea, I remained silent, carrying a weight that seemed to grow heavier each day. Since my mother passed away in a car accident a few months earlier, I had been living with my grandmother. She was a woman hardened by life and alcohol, spending her nights in bars around Westwood, the troubled and conflict-filled neighborhood where we lived. When she returned home, always late and drunk, I would hide in my room to avoid her screams and criticisms. I heard rumors in the neighborhood that she was involved in illegal activities, using the house to hide criminals during police raids. I felt alone and powerless in the face of it all. Even surrounded by so much hostility, I kept alive the memories of my mother. Before falling asleep, I would mentally revisit precious moments. The contagious sound of her laughter, her sweet vanilla perfume, the nights she would cradle me with soft songs. These memories were my refuge, a safe shelter where I hid from the pains of the present. On the day of the activity, I took the only photo I had of her, us smiling, embraced in a park. I collected marigold flowers along the way, carrying them carefully in my small hands. While my classmates decorated altars with photos of grandparents, parents, and siblings, I assembled mine. It was simple, but loaded with meaning. I placed my mother's photo in the center, surrounded by the flowers, a bread of the dead that I received from a neighbor, a candle I found at home, and a sugar skull that the teacher gave me to complete the altar. As I assembled the altar, I felt a tightness in my chest. The other children laughed and shared stories, but I remained in silence, contemplating the altar with a distant look. The teacher approached, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Your altar is beautiful. I'm sure your mother would be very proud of you," she said, offering a welcoming smile. I nodded without saying anything, but her words touched something deep within me. At the end of classes, I decided I would visit the cemetery to show the altar to my mother and tell her how much I missed her. The Day of the Dead transformed the school into a vibrant spectacle of colors and aromas. Altars decorated with flowers, candles, and sugar skulls. Teachers and students walked among the tributes, admiring the work and sharing stories about loved ones. But I remained on the sidelines, alone with my pain. During recess, while the other children played and laughed, I felt drawn to a place that no one wanted to go, the abandoned bathroom of the school. There were rumors among the students about strange sounds and dancing shadows there. That place was avoided by everyone, but for some reason, something invisible seemed to pull me there. The bathroom was at the end of a somber corridor, with worn doors hanging from the hinges and the floor covered with debris. I walked slowly, feeling my hesitant steps echo in the empty space. The air was dense, and when a low sound, almost a whisper, came from the back, a shiver ran through my skin. I stopped at the entrance, fixing my eyes on the darkness ahead. Fear and fascination mingled, paralyzing me. There in the back, a female silhouette began to form. It was a diffuse contour, but unmistakable. My heart raced, and I took a few steps forward, barely able to breathe. The figure floated in a soft, almost unreal manner, and with each movement, an icy shiver ran up my spine. "Mom," I whispered, almost unable to believe what I was seeing. She stopped and turned to me. Even without being able to see her face clearly, I knew it was her. Tears sprung forth before I could contain them. With my throat tight, I took another step, and that's when I heard her voice, that sweet and familiar voice that I could never forget. "Ryan," she said, and for an instant, all the weight of the world seemed to disappear. Before I could respond, her voice became firmer, laden with urgency. "I can't stay with you. You need to find your father. He can take care of you." I stood still, not quite understanding. "My father, but I don't know where he is," I murmured, trying to find answers amid the confusion. "You must find him. Your grandmother is not good for you." "Look for him," she insisted, and her voice had as much affection as concern. Before I could ask more, she began to disappear. The silhouette dissolved into the darkness, and suddenly I was alone again, trembling and trying to process what had just happened. I remained there for a few minutes, motionless, before running back to the courtyard, my mind in turmoil. The rest of the day passed like a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. How could I find a father I didn't even know? When the last bell rang, I gathered my things and went home, still lost in my thoughts. Upon arriving, I found my grandmother in the kitchen, the table cluttered with a half-empty bottle of liquor. I don't know if it was courage or desperation, but I told her what had happened. I needed answers, anything that would help me. "Grandma, today at school I saw my mother. She said I need to find my father," I said, my voice trembling. She raised her eyes, her face laden with contempt. "Don't talk nonsense, boy. Your mother is dead, and your father doesn't exist for us. Stop inventing these stories and go find something useful to do," she replied before taking another swig from the bottle. I lowered my head under the crushing weight of her words. Even so, deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore what I had heard. I retreated to my room, feeling the loneliness like never before. I hugged my pillow and cried until tears led me to sleep. And it was there, in dreams, that my mother returned, with the same firm voice full of tenderness. She repeated, "Look for your father, Ryan. Look for your father." I woke up different that morning. Something in me had changed. Her words wouldn't leave me alone, as if they were a call impossible to ignore. I decided I would make this my mission. I didn't know where to start, but I needed to try. Days passed, but the message continued to pursue me. Each night I dreamed of my mother, and her voice seemed more urgent each time, as if time were running out. One night I dreamed of something different. I was in a garden full of tall trees and vibrant flowers, next to an altar that looked very much like the one I had assembled at school. My mother was there smiling, but her eyes carried a silent concern. "Ryan, you must look for your father," she said, pointing to the horizon. I woke up with my heart racing. That was a clue, however vague, and it was enough. The next day, I decided to act discreetly. I began asking neighbors if anyone knew about my father, or remembered a man who had been close to my mother before I was born. After much insistence, An elderly lady, Mrs. Johnson, finally gave me an answer that brought hope. Yes, I remember a man named Isaac. He used to work at the trucking depot off Highway 9. He would come around here years ago, always with your mother. Perhaps he's who you're looking for, she said, gently caressing my hair. Those words gave me new determination. I decided that after school, I would go to the depot. That afternoon, I changed my usual route and headed toward the place. The depot was remote, away from the noise of the neighborhood. It was large and busy, full of workers and trucks coming and going. I felt small amid it all, but I continued, guided by the courage I had found within myself. As I walked among the trucks, looking for someone who could help me, an unexpected shiver ran down my spine. Turning around, I saw something that made me stop breathing for an instant. My mother. There she was, or perhaps her spirit, observing me from a distance. She smiled, that smile I knew so well, and pointed to a man who was working on an engine nearby. I took a deep breath and gathered all the strength I had to approach him. The man was robust, with dark hair and a thick beard, and seemed very focused on what he was doing. When he noticed my presence, he stopped and looked at me with curiosity. "Hello, kid. Are you lost?" he asked, cleaning his hands on an old cloth. My throat was tight, but I managed to respond, even if my voice came out trembling. "No, sir. I'm looking for my father. I think it might be you." He furrowed his brow, clearly surprised, and looked at me as if trying to find answers in my face. "What's your name, boy?" he asked, in a tone that seemed to have softened a bit. "My name is Ryan Miller. My mother was Sarah Miller. She died a few months ago and told me to look for my father," I said while feeling tears forming, but trying to control myself. He remained still, absorbing my words, and something changed in his expression. It was as if a sudden understanding had emerged. The man knelt down to be at my height, his eyes laden with emotion. "Who was your mother? Tell me," he insisted, his voice trembling. "My mother's name was Sarah. She died some time ago," I responded, unable to contain the tears now running down my face. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. When he opened them, they were full of water. "Son, I am your father. I'm Isaac," he said as he pulled me into a tight embrace. It was an overwhelming moment. The relief of finally finding him mixed with the sadness of everything that had led me there. "Mom said I should look for you. She's been helping me," I explained, looking around, perhaps hoping to see her again. He held my shoulders firmly, looking directly into my eyes. I've also been dreaming of your mother. She told me I needed to find you, but I never believed it. Now it all makes sense," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. Through tears, my father began to tell me what had happened. When my grandmother found out about my mother's pregnancy, she decided to separate them. Sarah, my mother, was threatened in every way, and soon after, my grandmother took her away. Any contact between them was met with intimidation. Criminals were sent to keep him away, and over time, he completely lost track of my mother. Despite this, he never gave up on her. The days that followed our meeting were intense, full of changes I never imagined. Isaac decided he would take care of me, and together we began to plan a new life. Shortly after, news arrived that left me stunned. My grandmother had died in a violent confrontation between gangs in the neighborhood. During the attack, our house was shot at, and many who were there also lost their lives. When we went to collect what remained of my belongings in the destroyed house, we found something that left us paralyzed. On my pillow was a fresh and intact marigold flower. My father and I stood there in silence, looking at the flower with tears running down our faces. I felt deep in my heart that this was an unmistakable sign from my mother. It was as if she were still there, protecting and caring for us, even after her death. Years later, when I shared this story with someone who also became important in my life, I saw the same expression of surprise and emotion that I felt on the day everything happened. If I hadn't lived through it all, perhaps it would be difficult to believe. But seeing the signs, feeling her presence in such crucial moments, I knew there was something real and profound in this story. And so began my new phase of life, alongside my father. Isaac fulfilled the promise he made to offer me a dignified life. And I knew that my mother, from somewhere, continued to guide and protect us. In the years that followed, her image came to occupy a special place in the altars we assembled. It was our way of recognizing the love that transcended death, and that, in the end, reunited father and son once again, now in safety and full of hope. I now live under the protection of this immortal love, alongside my father, carrying with me the certainty that my mother will always be present, caring for us in ways we may never fully comprehend. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. Imagine growing up without roots, being carried from one place to another, never having enough time or space to call something your own. My story begins amid a fragmented past, where each change brought uncertainty and challenges, shaping me to face life with resilience. But there's something more, a peculiar job that brought experiences that challenge logic and open doors to the inexplicable. This is my story. Speaking about my past has never been simple. If I had to choose a single word to describe my childhood, it would be wanderer. As far as I can remember, I never lived more than a year in the same house. My parents, I never knew them. I grew up being passed from one relative to another, depending on their circumstances. When I turned 16, my uncle, with whom I was living in a small town in rural Maine, called me for a conversation. He said I needed to pack my things and leave, because he could no longer support me. For me, this wasn't news, so my only question was where I would go next. He mentioned Aunt Rita, who lived in my hometown of Millfield, a dying logging community near the Canadian border. That news hit me like a ton of bricks. I had almost no contact with her, but the few interactions we'd had were marked by her acidic comments. If I dared to talk back, I'd end up with stinging ears after one of her infamous pinches. There was no alternative, so I accepted what lay ahead. I never had an appreciation for factory work. In Millfield, most people worked at the paper mill or in the timber industry. I tried both, and honestly, neither appealed to me. It was exhausting, and the pay didn't compensate for the effort. Even before I settled into my aunt's house, she made it clear that I needed to help with expenses. Each day without work meant less food on my plate. One evening, coming home, I passed by the town cemetery and noticed a sign on the gate, "Night Watchman Needed." The place was just a few minutes' walk from my aunt's house. It was divided into 3 areas, one open to the public, another reserved for wealthy families, and a third, almost unknown section designated for the local Jewish community. I decided to go in and ask about the position. I had to lie about my age, but it worked. They hired me and put me in charge of watching the last 2 areas. The next day I began. The cemetery had a simple entrance with an old stone wall surrounding the grounds and a single double gate. The access path was dirt, and the dampness made plants sprout between the cracks in the wall. They explained that I didn't need to patrol the entire cemetery all night. 3 rounds at different times were sufficient. They also gave me a small room in the administrative building, located across from a rarely used viewing room. My first night as a watchman was strangely peaceful. The silence seemed to have weight, as if each stone and tree in that place held ancient secrets. During my rounds, I observed details I had never noticed in cemeteries before. The tombstones in the public area were simple, some merely pieces of stone with crudely engraved names, while in the exclusive section, the tombs displayed elaborate sculptures, pompous inscriptions, and even small family mausoleums. The Jewish section, however, had a different air. It was more discreet, almost hidden, and the tombstones followed a uniformity that seemed loaded with respect and tradition. Walking there, I felt something I couldn't describe. It wasn't fear, but a kind of voluntary reverence. As the nights passed, I became accustomed to the routine. The rounds began to seem automatic, but I always made an effort to stay alert. The solitude of the work didn't bother me. In fact, it was almost a relief after tense days at my aunt's house. I felt more at ease among the dead than among the living. Still, there were moments when the environment seemed to test me. The wind that whistled through the trees sounded almost like voices whispering. The occasional creaking of the gate made my heart race, and the moon's reflections on the tombstones seemed to dance, creating disturbing shadows. Despite this, I remained firm. After all, this job was my only chance to escape the precarious situation I found myself in. Over time, I began to see the cemetery not just as a workplace, but as a space of interrupted lives that somehow continued there, silent. It was as if I was guarding not just a plot of land, but also memories, secrets, and legacies of people who had once wandered the world. They told me that on some days I would have the company of a man named Matthias. He was a well-known figure in the town, famous for his excessive fondness for alcohol. I was surprised to hear his name because, honestly, I found it hard to believe he was still alive. They also warned me that if I ever witnessed something unusual, something beyond teenagers trying to prove their courage, drunk men, or people late to leave the cemetery, I should call the authorities immediately. This warning brought to mind the stories I heard in my childhood, rumors of witches and demons performing rituals and sacrifices in the cemetery. I hadn't given credit to these stories before, but the warning made me wonder if there was a connection. Still, I decided not to worry about it and just agreed. That's how my first night began. At first, the tranquility was such that I began to fight against sleep. But then something abruptly woke me. the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. Without hesitation, I grabbed a stick that was leaning against the wall, turned on my flashlight, and followed the sound, determined. At that moment, I felt fearless, even imagining that if I encountered a witch, I would confront her and save the child. The crying came from a crypt the size of a small house. I walked around it a few times, but saw nothing, although the sound continued, now more muffled, seeming to come from inside the crypt. I pointed my flashlight hesitantly at the entrance, and what I saw defied any explanation. I don't have words to describe it. It looked like a deformed creature, something twisted and strange. When the flashlight beam hit it directly, it contorted, emitting a sound that mixed pain and crying. Suddenly, I heard something crawling in the back of the crypt. In an instant, the figure had disappeared. I ran back to my room in the office building, made the sign of the cross in front of a crucifix, and began to pray. My heart was racing. I locked myself in for the rest of the night, too afraid to go out. I knew I was neglecting my responsibility as a watchman, but no one would notice. I doubted the administrator would come to check on my work. I fell asleep at some point, but my rest was interrupted by a disturbing dream. I heard knocks on the window, and a childlike voice begging me to let it in. The voice said it was cold and hungry. However, there was something disturbing about that tone, despite sounding like a child. It conveyed a sense of unease that made my spine freeze. I woke up suddenly, sweating and with my heart racing. I lit a cigarette to try to calm down, and was almost finishing my second one when I heard loud knocks on the door. The shock made me drop the cigarette, which fell on my leg, leaving a small burn. On the other side of the door, Matthias's voice echoed. He said he needed to get some things he had forgotten. Reluctantly, I opened the door, and there was Matthias, barely able to balance himself. He was so drunk. When our gazes met, he opened a wide smile, almost as if he recognized something in me. It was as if he knew I had faced something inexplicable. "Did you see the cemetery children?" he asked, in a tone that mixed seriousness and resignation. I told Matthias I hadn't seen anything, and preferred not to mention what had happened a few hours earlier. He walked to his cot, pulled out a canvas bag that was stored underneath it, and as he turned to me, he delivered another of his phrases. "Don't pretend you don't know. I bet you saw the cemetery children. If we don't look for them, they'll find us." I chose to remain silent. It didn't make sense to argue with someone in that state, especially since, technically, I hadn't seen any children, but something quite different. Despite this, as much as I tried, my mind kept revisiting the image of that strange creature. I tried to convince myself that it could be some deformed animal, something born with a malformation. But as the first rays of sun emerged, the fear that had consumed me during the night dissipated along with the darkness. The next morning, it was my responsibility to unlock the cemetery gates. The administrator was already waiting outside, and when he asked how the night had been, I responded with a well-rehearsed lie, saying everything had gone well. He patted me on the shoulder and suggested I go rest. Later that same day, I ran into Matthias while buying cigarettes at the town's corner store. He greeted me enthusiastically, saying we were now work colleagues. Then he commented that he could cover for me during the nights if I was willing to pay with a few beers. I just nodded, with no enthusiasm to prolong the conversation. However, his countenance suddenly changed, becoming serious. He warned me, "If you see any of the cemetery children, don't follow them, no matter how much they ask for help." He insisted, "Ignore them for your own good." I let the warning pass as just another of Matthias's delusions and went on my way. But when the next night of work came, I bitterly regretted not paying more attention to what he had said. Upon returning to the cemetery, I finished the task of locking the padlocks on the gate when I noticed a man sitting near a mausoleum. I informed him that the place was closed, but offered to open the door and let him out. He apologized, explaining that he had lost track of time while visiting the tomb of an old love. I accompanied him to the exit, unlocked the gate, and watched him leave. Back to my rounds, everything seemed calm until the sound returned, the crying. Immediately, the shock made my heart race, bringing back the memory of the creature from the previous night. However, after a few minutes, another possibility came to mind. What if it was related to the stories that circulated in the town? Witches who kidnapped children for rituals in cemeteries. I thought about calling the authorities, but first I wanted to make sure it wasn't just a group of teenagers trying to scare me. I walked among the tombs and mausoleums, following the sound. That's when I saw her, leaning against a tombstone, a small girl, appearing to be no more than 6 years old. She was crying softly and didn't respond when I called her. I decided to approach. When I touched her shoulder, everything changed. She turned her head to me, revealing a grotesque and distorted face, with red, intense eyes, as if they were full of blood. A scream escaped from my mouth, and I ran desperately toward the room. Her laughter pursued me all the way, a cold, mocking sound that seemed to echo inside my mind. I locked myself in the room and didn't come out until dawn. When the day finally came, I made the decision to talk to the administrator and ask to leave the job. As I was saying goodbye, one thing was clear to me. I never wanted to go back to that place. That night, when my aunt asked me why I was still at home, I replied that I no longer wanted to work at the cemetery, avoiding going into details. As expected, she gave me a never-ending sermon with words that weighed so heavily that I ended up feeling guilty. This led me to reconsider. I called the administrator, made up an excuse saying I was a little sick, and justified my absence that night. But the next day, I decided to seek out the priest of the town's church. He was known for his kindness and for how he listened to people with patience. I told him everything that had happened, without interruptions. When I finished, the priest was direct. He said that what I had seen was not the spirit of a child, but rather an evil manifestation, something distorted that assumed innocent forms to attract victims. He advised me to stay away from the cemetery. I explained that, unfortunately, this was not an option. My aunt would not hesitate to throw me out of the house if I abandoned the job. The priest understood my situation and offered me a blessed rosary and a medal. He explained that if I saw something similar again, I should show the medal. I left the temple with his blessing and some hope of protection. Later that same day, the cemetery administrator came to my house. He said I could take another night of rest, but he needed my help for a burial and would pay me as if I had done the night watch. I agreed immediately, thinking that if I showed skill as a gravedigger, maybe I could change roles and leave the night watch behind. The burial took place at noon, on a stuffy day under a merciless sun. The deceased was an elderly man, and only a small group of people attended. No one stayed until the end. The tomb was made of marble and had already been prepared by a bricklayer, with only the lids remaining to be sealed. The burial took place in the Jewish section of the cemetery. Being Catholic, I found it strange to be in a place without crosses, and I remembered that there was rarely any movement in that section. I had always considered it an abandoned space. While I worked, an uncomfortable sensation began to grow. It seemed like someone was watching me. This made me nervous and hurried, avoiding looking around. But then I heard footsteps behind me. Instinctively, I turned my head. What I saw left me paralyzed. A boy was standing there, motionless. His skin was incredibly pale, and his eyes were entirely black, as if there was nothing beyond emptiness in them. He seemed more like an image than a real child. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just stood there still. I dropped my tool and began to back away, careful not to turn my back. It was at this moment that I bumped into another cemetery employee. He noticed my expression and asked what was happening. Instead of trying to explain, I just led him to the place where I had seen the boy. But to my frustration, there was no one there anymore. However, we found something on the ground. It was the head of a porcelain doll. The piece was broken and covered in mold. I picked it up carefully, but as soon as I did, a centipede came out from inside it. Instinctively, I shook my hand, letting the head fall to the ground. The impact shattered it even more, and dozens of other insects began to come out from inside. The other employee just observed the scene with indifference and told me to get back to work, as if it were something ordinary. As he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something very wrong continued to lurk in that place. That night was filled with nightmares. I can't remember the details of what I dreamed, but upon waking, I saw something that froze my spine. The same boy I had encountered in the cemetery was standing at the foot of my bed. His eyes, black as two empty abysses, stared at me in the darkness. I let out a scream so loud that my aunt and a cousin came running to my room. The instant they arrived, the figure disappeared. I made up that it was just a nightmare and that everything was fine. The idea of returning to the cemetery caused me overwhelming anxiety. I felt a weight in my chest just thinking about it. Finally, I understood why Matthias resorted so much to drink. Perhaps inebriated, it was easier to bear the horrors of that place. The night came when I needed to return. I gathered all the courage I had, determined to ask the administrator to move me to the gravedigger position. But to my surprise, Matthias was waiting for me. He announced that we would do the shift together. The division was clear. One would stay in the private area where there had been recent thefts of tombstones and bronze statues, while the other would patrol the other part. Despite the fear pulsing within me, I felt relieved not to be alone that night. I knew I couldn't hide in the room, while Matthias wandered around the cemetery on his own. Soon after settling my things, Matthias appeared and suggested I rest while he made the rounds. For a moment I considered accepting, but quickly discarded the idea. Perhaps it was a test to evaluate my commitment to the job. So we decided to split up. I was in charge of watching the private area for an hour, while Matthias patrolled the Jewish sector. Though reluctant, I went along with the plan. I took with me the rosary and the blessed medal that the priest had given me, like a kind of protective amulet. I walked carefully among the tombstones, trying to pay attention to every sound that echoed around me. It didn't take long for something to happen. Suddenly, a thick fog began to cover the cemetery, bringing with it an unbearable sulfur smell, like rotten eggs. Sounds of creaking toys and childish laughter began to echo in the darkness. My whole body tensed up. I called for Matthias, but the only responses I received were more children's laughter. I gripped the flashlight firmly and began to illuminate the surroundings. My heart was racing like never before. I was certain that something terrible was about to happen. Then I saw Matthias. He was standing with his back to me, motionless. His presence gave me momentary relief, and I began to call him as I approached. However, he didn't respond, not even when I touched his shoulder. He remained still, staring fixedly at a crypt. I followed his gaze, and there it was, a grotesque, twisted creature that immediately reminded me of the figure I had encountered on my first night as a watchman. Trembling, I pointed the flashlight toward the crypt, and that's when I saw him again. The pale-skinned boy was inside, smiling in a frightening way. In the distance, a female voice began to sing a childish melody, like a lullaby. Fear took hold of me. I approached Matthias and insisted that we needed to get out of there, but nothing I said seemed to have any effect. He remained like an immovable statue. With no other alternative, I gathered courage and left him behind, running back toward the room where I knew I would at least have some security. Today, I carry the weight of regret for my cowardice that night, but I try to comfort myself by thinking that perhaps there wasn't much I could do. Still, I can't avoid the questions that haunt me. Could I have dragged Matthias with me? Would I have had the courage to face the unknown with my rosary and a prayer, as the priest had suggested? But at that moment, all I did was run, guided by fear. I locked myself in the room in a hurry, the rosary tight between my fingers as I began to pray desperately. I called to God, begging to be delivered from that nightmare. However, that night, it seemed that only the devil himself was listening to my prayers. Chaos seemed to dominate the cemetery. Childish laughter echoed through the window, mocking my despair. Tears wouldn't stop falling as I recited prayer after prayer. Then I heard knocks on the door. It was Matthias's voice, begging me to open it. For a moment, I almost gave in, but something in the tone of his voice alarmed me. There was a disconcerting calmness, almost sarcastic, in his words. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I decided not to open it. I remained where I was, holding the rosary tightly and continuing to pray. My body, however, could no longer endure it. Uncontrollable tremors took over my hands, and an intense cold rose up the back of my neck. I began to see flashes of light, and suddenly everything went dark. I lost consciousness. I awoke to persistent knocking on the door. The sun was already shining outside, and my mind was still trying to process the horrors of that night. Without thinking, I opened the door and found myself facing the administrator, who was accompanied by a police officer and a paramedic. They bombarded me with questions, and I answered as best I could, but I noticed the skepticism in their looks. The police officer pointed to my hands, which continued to tremble uncontrollably. The paramedic checked my vital signs, and after finding that my blood pressure was dangerously high, they decided to take me to the hospital. Matthias was also taken there. They found him inside the crypt, completely paralyzed, not responding to any stimulus. At the hospital, they managed to make Matthias regain consciousness, but his reaction was frightening. He was beside himself, agitated and violent, as if his mind had been consumed by madness. It was necessary to sedate him to control him, and they finally decided to admit him to a mental institution. Gradually, I realized that I could no longer remain in that town. People began to treat me in a hostile manner, blaming me for what happened to Matthias. I tried to tell my version of the events, but no one wanted to listen. I decided to leave, and that was undoubtedly the best decision. Far from there, I found a good job and finally managed to establish myself on my own, away from my family and the painful memories of that place. Still, the marks of that experience haven't completely abandoned me. On some nights, the nightmares return as vivid as before, and I'm certain they will continue to accompany me, a dark reminder of everything I lived through and witnessed. My name is Xavier, and today I'm going to share a chapter of my life that I've always tried to erase from my memory. But no matter how hard I try, I know I'll never be able to push it away completely. At that time, I was 22 years old. My parents had kicked me out of the house after discovering my relationship with my partner. From that point on, I began a desperate search for a job that could support my expenses. But as if fate was having fun at my expense, I couldn't find anything for weeks. After sending countless resumes and participating in frustrating interviews, I finally received a call that would change everything. It was an offer to work as a night watchman at an isolated store in a remote area of northern Nevada. Although I wasn't enthusiastic about the location, I immediately accepted. The salary was good, and being a night shift, the job would allow me to continue my studies during my free time, as the responsibilities seemed straightforward. The first day was a mix of anxiety and expectation. As the manager explained my tasks, I noticed discomfort in his posture. He mentioned that the previous watchman had disappeared without leaving any clues. The strangest detail was that on the night of the disappearance, all the security camera recordings had vanished. However, since nothing had been stolen, the store decided not to pursue the investigation further. As soon as I was alone in the building, surrounded by shadows dancing in the dim light, I began my routine. My main activities were monitoring the cameras and making occasional rounds. The first few hours were peaceful. I divided my time between studying and observing the monitors. However, a feeling of unease began to grow. At one point, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. A robust figure appeared on one of the cameras. I looked directly at the monitor, but no one was there. My heart accelerated, and a shiver ran down my spine. I then noticed that the curtain leading to the storage area was slightly swaying, as if it had just been touched. Despite trying to convince myself it could just be a breeze, tension took hold of me. Gathering courage, I decided to investigate. I carefully entered the storage area and turned on the light. It was a dark environment, full of dusty shelves and objects left at random. The feeling that something was wrong only increased with each step. At the back of the storage room, I noticed a large cabinet. My hands were wet with sweat as I slowly approached to open the door. What I found inside made me scream in pure terror. It was an old costume, but very peculiar. It seemed to be the store's mascot, a bizarre figure that mixed hyena and lion characteristics, with a worn-out and macabre appearance. Its opaque eyes and distorted smile seemed to stare at me from the depths of that cabinet. Despite being just an abandoned piece of clothing, it emanated an indescribable sense of terror. I closed the cabinet door with such force that the sound echoed throughout the storage room, and I backed away, trembling from head to toe. The store, previously just silent, now seemed immersed in a heavy and disturbing atmosphere. I returned to my post in the camera room, but what I had witnessed in the storage area wouldn't leave my mind. Every shadow seemed to move suspiciously, and any sound, however low, made my heart race. When dawn finally arrived, I left the store feeling an indescribable relief. During the day, I tried to rest, but my dreams were invaded by the vision of that costume. I dreamed of a dark and infinite corridor where I ran endlessly, trying to escape while that grotesque figure chased me. The sound of its grunts echoed in my ears, and I was certain I was about to be devoured. I woke up gasping, covered in sweat, with the image of the costume etched in my mind. Despite the fear, that night I returned to work. The hours seemed to drag on like never before, as I remained locked in the camera room. Each movement on the screens and every noise in the environment increased my tension. But the most terrifying moment was yet to come. At exactly 4:44 in the morning, an icy whisper took over the room. It was a distorted voice, almost supernatural, repeating my name in a disturbing way. I looked at the monitors, but couldn't identify where the sound was coming from. The room became cold, as if something malevolent had dominated it. My hands were sweating, and my heart seemed ready to leap out of my chest. I decided to do my usual round in an attempt to distract myself, but that only worsened the sensation of being watched. Even when I returned to the room, the feeling didn't disappear. Suddenly, the monitors began to display static and interference. I tried to stay calm, but when I looked up, I saw something that froze my blood: the costume. It was standing in the corridor, motionless and frightening, with the same grotesque smile and empty eyes that had terrified me before. It was impossible, but there it was, staring at me in the darkness. Without thinking, I ran to the door and tried to lock it, but I couldn't take my eyes off that figure. It began to move in my direction, with slow and awkward, but determined steps. With each moment, the whispers became more intense, repeating my name like a sinister chant. The costume was getting closer and closer, and I felt my body paralyzed by fear. When the creature was just a few inches from me, the clock on the wall struck 5 in the morning. In the blink of an eye, it simply disappeared as if it had never existed. The room returned to normal, the cold dissipated, the monitors stopped failing, and the whisper ceased. But I was still there, alone, with my mind flooded by terror and confusion. After that night, I seriously thought about never returning to the store. The memories were still fresh, and I jumped at every noise or shadow around me. However, after talking with my partner, I decided to reconsider. They argued that all of that could be the result of my mental exhaustion. amplified by the oppressive environment of night work. They also reminded me how hard I had fought to get that job, and how difficult it would be to find another with such flexible hours for studying. Reluctantly, I decided I would return the following night. The night was going peacefully until, at 3:33 in the morning, the same oppressive sensation I already knew took over the environment. I tried to convince myself it was just a product of my imagination, so I kept myself busy with tasks, ignoring the growing discomfort. It was time to do the rounds through the store, a part of the job I hated, but which needed to be done. I grabbed my flashlight and began to walk through the dark corridors, where the darkness seemed to swallow every corner. To alleviate the tension, I started humming a song that always calmed me down. However, the only sound that filled the space was the echo of my footsteps. Something within me whispered that I wasn't alone. The pinnacle of tension came when I approached the storage area. The knot in my stomach tightened even more, but despite the dread, I went on, determined not to stop. I passed the storage area quickly without looking inside, but as I left it behind, I felt as if a heavy gaze was fixed on my back. Everything in me screamed not to turn and look. I quickened my pace toward the camera room, but on the way, I had to cross a corridor where several mirrors were on display for sale. It was then that, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something terrifying. A faded fabric paw that I immediately recognized as part of that horrible costume, approaching my shoulder. Panic took hold of me, and I ran like never before to the security room. As soon as I entered, I locked the door and threw myself in front of the monitors, desperately searching for any sign of what I had seen. All the screens showed was the storage area curtains slowly swaying, as in a morbid dance. Exhausted and terrified, I remained there until dawn, without the courage to leave. Each minute that passed was suffocating, and the idea that something was lurking out there kept me on alert. With the first rays of sun, I finally left the room cautiously, fearing what I might find. I told my partner what had happened. They tried to reassure me, arguing that all of that could be the result of stress and sleep deprivation. Maybe it was a nightmare, they suggested, something amplified by the oppressive atmosphere of the job. As absurd as it seemed, I tried to accept their explanation. After all, the idea of an old costume coming to life was completely illogical for someone like me, who always considered myself skeptical. In the following days, I decided to take some precautions to feel more secure. I put a padlock on the storage room cabinet, ensuring that nothing else could get out of there. No one seemed to notice or question the padlock, and this gave me a sense of relief. For almost a month, there were no strange incidents, and I began to believe I had overcome that situation. But this calm ended abruptly one night. Upon arriving for my shift, I was surprised by a new development. The manager had hired a second watchman. Louis, a man of about 40, was introduced to me, and the manager asked me to explain the routines and procedures of the night work. Louis caught on quickly, and after a brief explanation and a single walk through the store, he already seemed to dominate everything. This gave me a break, allowing me to focus on my studies for the rest of the night. While the night seemed to be following its usual course, Louis pointed to something near the storage area. I looked in the direction of the swaying curtain, and a chill ran through my body. Hiding my dread, I told Louis I hadn't seen anything and suggested we simply ignore it. But Louis, disregarding my insistence, decided to investigate on his own. My pleas for him not to go were useless. In the camera room, I observed Louis's every movement through the monitors. He entered the storage area and said something I couldn't hear, since the cameras didn't record audio. I saw him walking toward the old cabinet that I had locked with the padlock. My eyes widened when I noticed he opened the door with ease, as if the padlock had never been there. I suppressed a scream when I noticed the cabinet was completely empty. My mind was spinning in a whirlwind of questions. How had that cabinet been opened? And more disturbingly, where was the costume that I knew should be inside? The feeling that something sinister was hiding in the store became almost unbearable. Louis returned to the camera room, but he seemed visibly shaken. It wasn't long before he began to feel ill, being forced to go home before the end of the shift. The next night, Louis didn't show up for work. At first, I imagined he had simply quit the job. But horror took on new proportions when his wife informed us that he had never returned home and was missing. Days passed slowly, followed by weeks and finally months. The store acquired an obscure reputation, especially after it spread that the last place Louis was seen was in the parking lot. The security cameras had captured a robust figure in the shadows before presenting failures, and then nothing else was recorded. Despite the fear and growing curiosity, I continued working at the store. My financial obligations left me no other choice. My partner tried to convince me to abandon the job, concerned for my safety, but my need and an inexplicable stubbornness made me insist. One night, while reviewing the recordings, I noticed something peculiar on one of the cameras, an indistinct figure moving erratically through the corridors. I observed carefully and realized there was something familiar about it. The grotesque outline resembled the costume I had seen in the cabinet. My heart raced when the figure began to approach the storage area curtain. Panic dominated me as I watched the curtain swing violently, more than it had ever done. 1,000 thoughts crossed my mind, but in an impulse I can't explain, I decided to face the unknown. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the storage area. With each step, the air seemed denser, almost suffocating. I finally reached the curtain, and with trembling hands, I pulled it open at once. The storage area was empty. There was no sign of the costume or any other presence. The curtain returned to quietude, and everything seemed as before. A wave of frustration took hold of me. The feeling that the store, with all its mystery, was mocking me was unbearable. That sequence of inexplicable events began to erode my sanity, leaving me trapped in a cycle of doubt and fear that seemed to have no end. Each night seemed more oppressive, as if the very air around me carried the weight of fear. My nerves were on edge, and my mind wandered between thoughts of dread and a dark obsession. I spent a good part of the shift fixing my eyes on the camera screens, waiting but fearing to see something emerge from the shadows. Then, on one of those nights, I was yanked from the monotony by a sound that made me jump, seized by a primitive fear. The noise came from a pile of boxes stacked in a poorly lit corner of the store. My breathing became short, and my heart raced as I fixed my gaze in that direction. The boxes seemed enveloped in a denser darkness, and the sound repeated as if something was moving among them. I I took a step back, the fear growing inside me, but my movement was interrupted by a soft and horrifying shock. I froze when I realized what was behind me. The costume was there, motionless but alive somehow, with its twisted smile and those plastic eyes that seemed to pierce my soul. Terror completely paralyzed me. I couldn't scream or move. A terrible odor took over the air, an acrid smell of rotting meat, something so nauseating that it seemed impregnated in my very skin. It was impossible to ignore, and my brain was taken over by disturbing images of what might be hidden under that dirty and worn fabric. And then the silence was broken by screams, human screams coming from inside the costume. They were anguished, as if entire souls were trapped in there. One of those screams made my blood freeze. It was Louis. There was no mistaking his voice, even in those conditions. The horror reached a new peak when the costume moved, holding me with brutal force. Its distorted laugh echoed like a nightmare in my ears, and panic took over me. I desperately fought, trying to free myself from that inhuman grip. My muscles trembled with effort, but it was like fighting against a wall. When I thought I was lost, in a surge of pure desperation, I gathered strength I didn't know I possessed and managed to escape. I ran like I had never run before, with my lungs burning and my heart racing. I didn't look back. Every instinct in me screamed that would be fatal. When I finally reached the exterior of the store, the fresh air enveloped me like an embrace of relief. I made a promise to myself there, under the dark sky. I would never return to that place. I would never again face the horrors that had haunted me there. The store became a dark symbol in my memory, a chapter I preferred to erase, but that would leave deep scars on my mind and soul. The years passed, and the store eventually closed its doors forever, a fate that seemed inevitable given what had happened there. But even so, its story never left me. The memory of the screams, the putrid smell, and that macabre smile still torment me. I know there are secrets that the world shouldn't unravel, things that belong to the shadows. And even now, as I tell this story, I feel that these secrets are still watching me, waiting patiently in the depths of oblivion. A few years ago, when I was still a young man living in a modest town along the Oregon coast, something curious happened in that place. Everyone's attention seemed to revolve around an ancient estate, surrounded by mystery and frightening legends. It was the largest property in the region, and fed the most disturbing narratives that people shared. At the center of these stories were three women who, according to legend, were the last inhabitants of the estate in a distant past. Their reputation was sinister. They were suspected of being responsible for heinous crimes against young people from the community and other actions that no one dared to mention. There was no shortage of those who believed they were witches. The looming threat warned that if anyone dared to cross the gates of the estate at night, they would never return. These stories were only strengthened by three specific cases that happened over time. Three young men with a reputation for troublemaking entered the estate, apparently looking for some kind of treasure. After that, no one saw them again. While some argued that everything was just coincidences, and that the young men had probably left town with whatever they had found, most couldn't shake off the fear that the stories provoked. I, however, was a skeptical teenager. To me, These legends were nothing more than inventions created by people looking for a distraction from the monotony of such a small town. I had a concrete reason to disbelieve the stories. A watchman, a man named Ralph, used to patrol the estate to ensure everything was in order. If the place was so cursed, why was he still working there? One day, returning from school, something unusual happened. I noticed a man I had never seen before standing by the estate gates. In a town where everyone knew everyone, finding a stranger was something that caught attention. The gates were slightly open, and the man was staring fixedly at the interior of the grounds. My curiosity didn't leave me in peace, and I approached carefully, trying to understand what was happening. The man noticed my presence, and with a curious look, asked if I knew Ralph, the watchman. I confirmed that I did, although it had been a few days since I'd seen him. He just nodded as if this was something common, and explained that he was the owner of the estate. He said he had been trying to speak with Ralph, without success, for several days. That surprised me, as I hadn't even imagined that place had an owner. We talked for a few minutes, and before I could leave, he made me an unexpected proposal. He wanted me to take over the watchman job at the estate. He promised a salary that seemed incredible, much more than I had ever dreamed of earning. The task was simple, just occasionally check if everything was in order. Without thinking much, I accepted. After all, it seemed an offer too good to refuse. On my first night of work, as soon as I crossed the gates of the estate, a feeling of discomfort took hold of me. Everything was immersed in absolute silence, and the darkness seemed to have a presence of its own. The stories about the estate came back to my mind, but I tried to push them away. I couldn't allow these superstitions to control me. With a flashlight in hand, I walked through the entire property, examining every corner. Everything seemed normal, with nothing unusual in sight. As the hours passed, I began to relax. I convinced myself that the legends were nothing but inventions. But when the clock struck midnight, something changed. I heard murmurs. They were soft voices, like whispers, and they seemed to come from all sides at once. My body reacted with a shiver, and my flashlight trembled as my heart raced. I decided I had shown enough courage for one night and resolved to leave. However, upon reaching the gates, I noticed something strange. They were firmly closed. When I tried to open them, they didn't move even a millimeter, as if they were sealed by some invisible force. Panic began to take over me, especially because the whispers around me didn't cease. In the pitch dark, the shadows seemed to come alive, moving in a disturbing way as if they had a will of their own. Every window or door I tried to open was inexplicably blocked. I was trapped in a place that defied any logical explanation. The murmurs intensified, transforming into distorted words that echoed in my mind. Suddenly, I saw a silhouette in the distance. It was something like a shadow, but its movements were disturbing and didn't follow any human logic. The figure slowly advanced toward me. Desperate, I continued looking for a way out, but each attempt was futile. Time seemed to dissolve. I no longer knew how much had passed, and my mind oscillated between fear and disbelief. When I finally gave in to curiosity, I turned to what I felt was behind me. It was then that I saw them. 3 spectral forms appeared before me, wearing long, worn-out garments. There was no denying it. They were the women from the legends. Their faces carried expressions deformed by malice, and their eyes shone with a cruelty impossible to describe. I remained motionless, paralyzed by horror, as they observed me with a mixture of scorn and hatred. After those figures stared at me, absolute terror took hold of me. My mind went blank, and I ended up fainting. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I awoke, I felt the warmth of the first rays of sun touching my face. I got up with difficulty, noticing that my body was covered with dirt and dry leaves. My clothes were in tatters, completely torn. The memories of the previous night came back like a whirlwind, and a chill ran down my spine. The images of the three women and the whispers that still echoed in my mind were impossible to ignore. Without thinking twice, I left that cursed place as fast as I could. With each step that took me away from the estate, I felt the weight of oppression diminish and a small feeling of relief emerge. When I got home, I realized that my parents hadn't even noticed my absence during the night. That was a relief, as I didn't want to explain what had happened. I took a long shower, trying to wash away not only the accumulated dirt, but also the fear and discomfort that still haunted me. Even so, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake off the memories of those sinister figures and the disturbing whispers. I spent the entire day in a state of tension, as if something was still watching me. My friend Caleb soon noticed my unease and wanted to know what was happening. I knew I couldn't lie to him, so I reported everything without omitting any detail. He listened attentively, but when I finished, he let out a laugh. Normally, I would have laughed along with him, but the experience was still too vivid for me to find it funny. When he realized I was serious, Caleb tried to reassure me, saying that I had probably let myself be carried away by the local stories. Maybe you saw something bad in the dark and, seized by panic, fainted. The rest was just a dream mixed with the suggestion of the legends, he said. His arguments were rational and in a way made sense. He pointed out that if there was something truly supernatural there, it wouldn't be logical for those spirits to want to remain trapped in a town that not even the living wanted to inhabit. And if the women were as dangerous as the legends said, they could have done much worse than just scare me. Although Caleb's explanations had brought some relief, I still wasn't completely convinced. My instinct told me something was wrong. I decided that perhaps the best thing would be to abandon the watchman job. However, before I could really make that decision, Caleb interrupted me. He said I would be a fool to resign, considering the amount of money involved. Besides, he proposed that to make me feel more secure, he would accompany me on the next vigil. I knew the real reason for his proposal was his curiosity to explore the estate. But at that moment, all I cared about was the fact that I wouldn't have to face it alone. Against my will, I ended up agreeing. Still, as night approached, a growing unease took hold of me. Returning to that place would be a test of my limits, but at least I would have Caleb by my side. When the time finally came, we set off together for the estate. The moon was full in the sky, illuminating the path with a silvery light, while the wind passed through the trees, creating an unsettling sound. The scenery seemed even more threatening under the moonlight. The shadows moved strangely, as if they had a will of their own. As we approached the gate, we entered the estate carefully, using our flashlights to illuminate our way. Caleb seemed calm and full of courage, while I fought against a heavy feeling in my chest. The memories of the previous night tried to invade my mind, but I forced myself to ignore them. Caleb's presence brought me a certain comfort, and I did everything to not appear fearful in front of him, maintaining a facade of calm. We spent much of the night talking and laughing. Caleb had brought with him some whiskey that he had borrowed from his father's pantry, insisting it was a delicious drink. I tried just a few sips. The taste was horrible to me, but he seemed to appreciate every sip. The moonlight dimly illuminated the estate grounds, and for a moment, I almost forgot the fear I had felt the previous night. The company and laughter made the experience more bearable, as if the somber environment lost some of its strength. Over time, we decided to explore the interior of the estate even more. Despite the jokes and the light tone, we both felt a tension in the air, as if something invisible was observing us. The shadows around us seemed denser, and the sound of the boards creaking under our steps echoed as if the house itself was whispering. Finally, we reached a room at the back of the property. The door was partially open, and from there came a cold that didn't seem natural. I exchanged a look with Caleb, and although we were both nervous, the effect of the whiskey and the desire not to appear cowardly pushed us inside. In the room, everything seemed uninteresting. Old furniture covered with dust and moldy books that barely resisted time. It was then that Caleb found something curious, a very old newspaper. On the cover, the headline announced the capture of the Sisters of Evil. Curious, we began to read the yellowed pages. The article described in shocking detail the terrible crimes attributed to the three women. Although we already knew of their reputation, we had never come across such vivid descriptions of their acts. The discomfort increased with each line until we decided to leave the room, disgusted by what we had just read. We were almost ready to end our visit and return home. However, before going, Caleb warned that he needed to step away to urinate. I was left alone for a few minutes, facing the heavy silence of the night. The shadows around me seemed to come alive, distorted by the pale light of the moon, while the trees assumed grotesque forms. It was at this moment that the murmurs began again. They emerged subtly at first, but soon became louder, coming from all directions. They seemed like voices coming from a place beyond human understanding, pronouncing words I couldn't comprehend. My body tensed, and a shiver ran down my spine. I looked in the direction of a darker corner of the grounds, illuminated only by the moonlight, and then I saw it. A distorted face emerged from the penumbra, with a twisted smile and empty eyes that seemed to see directly into my soul. Horror took hold of me, and a scream escaped before I could control it. I called for Caleb desperately, my voice loaded with fear. My scream brought Caleb running back, his face stamped with concern. He seemed not to understand what was happening, but at that moment, all I wanted was not to be alone. I pointed to the corner where I had seen the disfigured face, but upon following my gesture, Caleb found nothing. The whispering voices that before seemed to fill the air with their disconcerting presence had disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. He tried to reassure me, saying it was all just a product of my imagination. For him, the whiskey and the scary stories we had told had left me suggestible, creating illusions. Although his words were reasonable, I knew deep inside that what I had seen and heard was real, something that couldn't be so easily dismissed. My heart was still beating in a mismatched way as Caleb tried to calm me down. But the fear I felt seemed to begin to affect him too. Despite his calm tone, it was clear that he was also beginning to feel vulnerable. Deep down, we both knew something uncommon was happening at that estate, something that escaped logic and went beyond the simple domain of imagination. Without delay, we decided it was time to leave. We walked toward the gates, believing that upon crossing them, the feeling of oppression would disappear along with the sinister environment. However, upon reaching the entrance, we were taken by a terrifying shock. The doors we had left open were now firmly closed and wrapped in rusty chains. There was no lock or padlock, just the chains, as if they were part of the estate itself, keeping us trapped. We tried to force the gates with all our strength, but they didn't yield. It was as if the estate had decided it wouldn't let us leave. Despair began to consume us as we frantically searched for another exit. We explored every corner, but all the doors and windows we found were sealed in an inexplicable way, as if an invisible force was imprisoning us. The feeling of weight in my chest intensified, and the disturbing murmurs returned, growing in volume and clarity. The incomprehensible words seemed to engrave themselves in our minds like a malicious echo. Time lost meaning, the night seemed endless, and the moon that remained high in the sky was a mute witness to our suffering. As we searched for a way out, objects around us began to move. Furniture trembled, shadows extended as if they were alive, and the estate itself seemed to breathe with a somber energy. Panic mixed with a sense of powerlessness as Caleb and I looked at each other, aware that we were facing something far beyond our understanding. After what seemed like hours of futile search, Caleb found a hammer. For a brief moment, we felt a spark of hope. We smiled, believing we finally had a chance to escape. He approached the gates and struck the chains with all his strength. However, what happened next froze our smiles and took the air from our lungs. There, in the center of the room, appeared the three women. They stood motionless, with their cold gazes fixed on us. Their expressions were a mixture of malice and disdain, their twisted smiles as if they knew we were powerless before them. There was no doubt, those figures weren't just echoes of a legend or a product of our imagination. They were there, real and threatening. Fear took hold of us again, but this time I remained conscious. Caleb and I slowly backed away, each movement calculated, aware that we were facing a real and imminent danger. The three women began to approach. Their slow steps seemed deliberate, as if they wanted to prolong our despair. It was as if time had stopped, each second dragging on as we tried not to lose control. The figures advanced with a threatening aura, their torn dresses dragging behind them. There was no visible exit. We were cornered in the darkest corner of that cursed estate. I looked at Caleb, and the panic in his face reflected what I felt. We both knew we needed to react, but terror paralyzed us. Even the hammer in his hands trembled so much that it seemed useless. Suddenly, without exchanging a word, we both acted on instinct. We ran toward the exit with all the strength our legs could gather. Caleb, without hesitation, began to strike the rusty chains that sealed the gates. His movements were desperate, as if his life depended on it, and it really did. I could see he was hurting his own hands, but that didn't stop him. Finally, as if by a miracle, the chains gave way and the gates opened. We didn't think twice. We crossed the exit and ran as fast as possible toward the town. Neither Caleb nor I dared to look back, afraid of what we might see. We just wanted to distance ourselves from that somber place. Even so, the dread didn't abandon us, as if the shadows of the estate were still pursuing us. The next day we made a pact. We would never return to that place, no matter what was said or what we were offered. Now we knew that the stories and legends were true, and that the estate hid something far beyond what logic could explain. We never understood the exact reason why those women wanted to keep us there, but one thing was certain: we didn't want to find out. With the passage of time, we tried to leave what happened behind. Life went on, but the memories of that night never completely disappeared. For many in the town, the stories of the estate continued to be just that, stories. But Caleb and I knew the truth. As much as I needed the money that job offered, I learned a valuable lesson. Some things aren't worth the risk. Sanity, safety, and even life itself are much more precious. The estate was left behind as a memory that still haunts me, but I would never dare to return. I'm going to tell a story that involves the wife of a former college colleague, now a cardiologist at a major hospital. This episode happened about 20 years ago, around 2005. For privacy reasons, I kept the details confidential for a long time. However, after talking with those involved and obtaining authorization, I can now share what occurred. Juliana, the wife, and her husband had sought me out for a consultation. They believed that as a psychiatrist, I could help her with a series of problems that had been afflicting her for several months already. It all began, according to her account, after she had attended a wedding held in the same church where the two had married years before. On that day, Juliana began to feel ill suddenly. A strong pain in her stomach, accompanied by nausea, overwhelmed her. Staying at the location became unbearable, and something even stranger happened. Her legs stopped responding, as if they were completely paralyzed, making any movement impossible. She only managed to leave the place when the ceremony ended, and even then, with just a slight improvement, enough to return home. In the days that followed, the symptoms persisted and began to interfere with her routine. At night, she suffered from headaches so intense that they prevented her from sleeping. When it wasn't that, she had bouts of nervousness that evolved into severe anxiety or panic attacks. At first, Juliana preferred not to share what she was going through, fearing others would consider her insane. She decided to self-medicate, but the results were null. As a deeply religious person, she believed that faith could bring her relief and balance. However, this search for spiritual refuge brought unexpected reactions. A few weeks after the symptoms began, she participated in a pilgrimage on foot to a sanctuary. There, upon entering the temple, she felt something she described as a mixture of opposing feelings: an immense love and joy upon seeing the image of the Virgin, but also an inexplicable hatred that terrified her. This emotional duality, which she described as a state of intense confusion, profoundly affected the relationship she previously had with spaces and figures that used to bring her peace. One day, while preparing dinner at home, Juliana noticed something strange with a picture that decorated her living room. In it was the image of Jesus as the Lord of Divine Mercy. The face and hair of the figure seemed to be in flames, At that moment, she thought perhaps she was having a hallucination. She then decided to seek prayer groups to find some peace. However, the more involved she became, the worse her symptoms were: intense headaches, a feeling of weight in her legs, nausea, chills in her body and in her hair. These sensations also began to emerge in her home, accompanied by a growing detachment from her husband, which led the couple to take more extreme measures. A notable event occurred during their vacation that same year. They went to the lake, took some time away from work, routine, and their children, almost like a second honeymoon. Everything seemed fine until the end of a Sunday, after a day together at the lake. Back at the lodge where they were staying, Juliana became inexplicably irritated with her husband, even after they had spent a pleasant afternoon. In an attempt to reconcile, he hugged her and began to kiss her. Initially, she reciprocated, but suddenly froze, becoming cold as if she had fallen into a deep sleep. Upon calling her, he realized something was wrong. Her body became rigid and began to have contractions, as if she were receiving electric shocks. First, the spasms affected her legs and soon spread throughout her body. To make matters worse, Juliana began to emit frightening sounds that seemed more like laments loaded with agony. Her terrified husband tried to hold her, but she reacted with strange movements, raising her head with fixed, wide-open eyes. The color of her irises seemed to have darkened, her pupils were unchanged, and she repeatedly stuck out her tongue, accompanied by almost animalistic screams. Desperate, he began to pray, convinced that something very wrong was happening. In the face of this experience, they decided they needed specialized help and came to seek me out. In the first consultations, I treated Juliana like any other patient with anxiety crises or a medical disorder that could be clinically approached. However, even being skeptical and never having witnessed anything like it, I began to realize that this went beyond the medical sphere. Initially, the environment in her house became calmer, and Juliana began to show some stability. But this didn't last long. Soon the episodes returned with force. She presented crises of anger, became increasingly nervous, and reported feeling as if she were another person. On several occasions, she confessed to dark thoughts that deeply disturbed her. Professionally, I felt I no longer knew how to proceed, especially because the events began to surpass the barriers of the office. The most disturbing thing was to realize that inexplicably, similar sensations began to occur in my own home. One night, upon arriving from work, I had an unsettling sensation, as if someone was inside my house. When I went to the bedroom, this presence seemed even stronger. For a brief moment, I saw what appeared to be the silhouette of a tall man standing at the door. In the blink of an eye, the figure disappeared. To be able to sleep that night, I needed to take medication. However, upon waking the next morning, I noticed that my shoulder and part of my back were marked by deep scratches. After that episode, I didn't see anything again, but the sensation that there was something or someone in the house never completely disappeared. I didn't take long to connect these events to my involvement in Juliana's treatment. It was evident that everything had begun after the sessions with her. Reluctant but without alternatives, I needed to accept that this situation surpassed any scientific or medical explanation. In a conversation with Juliana's husband, also a doctor, we both admitted that this didn't fit into what we knew as men of science. We concluded, after much reflection, that what was happening was something of a paranormal nature, and the only solution would be to seek help from a priest experienced in exorcisms. I decided to interrupt Juliana's psychiatric treatment, but continued to follow the situation from a distance. In a call with her husband, he confirmed that she was possessed. He and the children had witnessed a terrifying night in which Juliana began to scream at everyone, fixing her gaze on each one, and saying in a disturbing way that she was Lucifer. It's difficult to describe the terror that the family felt at that moment, but I can't imagine anything more frightening. Despite having stopped seeing her, the strange phenomena continued to happen in my house. On the same night that my friend told me about the demonic manifestation, when Juliana screamed that she was the devil himself, I went to bed and heard something that sounded like a pack of dogs howling. It was a sound that seemed to grow, as if it was coming directly toward my house. My skin bristled as never before, and in all the years living there, I had never heard anything similar. In those days, I resorted to measures I never imagined I would take. I lit candles in the house and sprinkled holy water in the rooms. Later, I found out that a priest, whose name I don't know, but to whom I am deeply grateful, performed the ritual that freed Juliana. It was a long and exhaustive process. According to what I was told, more than 15 sessions were necessary for her to be completely liberated. After that, things finally calmed down. I had the chance to meet the family again after everything ended. Although the process had been painful and frightening, tranquility returned to them, and finally to me as well. Juliana told me in detail how each session was more painful than the previous one. She described the sensation as if an extremely long, red-hot needle was being pushed through her body until it reached her throat. The pain, according to her, was indescribable, as if her entire body was in flames. During the sessions conducted by the priest, the environment was intense. Spitting, violent insults, abrupt movements, and even attempts to attack those present were part of the process. Each encounter seemed like a battle, both for her and for those who accompanied her. Only after this did I also manage to recover tranquility. Today, looking back, I see that decades have passed since these events, and fortunately, I never experienced anything similar again. Even so, I feel it's important to share this story, especially for those who still question the existence of evil. As a professional with years of experience in dealing with various types of crises and disorders, I can affirm that no medical or psychological condition explains what Juliana experienced. The events I witnessed, both in her case and in the inexplicable things that occurred around me, are far beyond what science can prove or understand. The only explanation I can give is that evil exists, and at that time, I encountered it face to face. Not all roadside stories are about accidents or common legends. Some hold secrets that connect us to the inexplicable, where supernatural beings seem to cross paths with our world. This is my experience, one that mixes technology, tradition, and a curious warning left by someone who seemed to know more than they should. I have a habit of listening to spooky stories while working from home. I use a small spherical device with touch-sensitive sensors to control the volume or pause, and play audio with a simple tap. The strange occurrences began, apparently, after I listened to stories about gnomes and fairies in a garden. I didn't connect the dots immediately until I came across a post in a Reddit forum where someone commented that, when listening to these stories at high volume without headphones, certain beings might be disturbed. That's when I realized that the strange things happening in my house coincided with the day I listened to an episode about the Cedar Point gnomes. I remember that while I was listening, the volume of my device would go up and down on its own, as if someone was adjusting it. The device had no defects. You could even hear the characteristic sound it makes when touched, although I was completely alone in my house. Then, without warning, the story stopped playing and random music started. I tried not to give it much importance, thinking it might just be a software glitch. Later, I told my brothers about it, but they just laughed, saying my device was cursed. This discouraged me from sharing more about it, and I decided to act as if nothing had happened. But that wasn't the end of the story. Last weekend, I went with my family to a small village in northern Vermont, known for its beliefs and stories about gnomes. Everything seemed normal until we entered a museum dedicated to these beings. Suddenly, a person approached me, completely ignoring my family, and said, "You're carrying one with you." At first, I thought I had misunderstood. He repeated, "You have a mischievous one beside you." I was truly stunned by what I heard. The only recommendation I received was to leave sweets and some coins as offerings for these beings, something that, according to this person, was important to do. Right outside, we met a group of motorcyclists. One of them, an older gentleman, decided to share with us a brief story explaining why they were there. He told us they believed in spirits that inhabit the roads. Long ago, a lone motorcyclist suffered an accident on one of these roads. The story says the accident was caused by gnomes that inhabited the path. While lying injured on the ground, the motorcyclist saw several of these small creatures approaching, trying to steal his saddlebags. In panic, he began throwing everything he could grab, any object he could reach in his bag. However, the last item he had left was a small metal bell. When he held the bell to throw it, the sound it produced seemed to bother the gnomes. They began to retreat, and soon they left him completely alone. Since that day, the motorcyclist never travels without carrying a bell attached to his bike, and makes a point of giving one to other solitary travelers. The motorcyclist who told us this story showed us the bell he had received. To my surprise, after finishing his tale, he handed me the small bell as a gift. He explained that I should hang it on my car in a place where it could tinkle while I was on the road. Despite not being sure if I believed it, I didn't hesitate and tied the bell to the lower part of the rear bumper. I know this isn't exactly a horror story, nor does it come close to the macabre narratives you might expect, but I wanted to share it because of how interesting that conversation was, and everything I heard in that village full of gnome stories. The curious thing is that now, when I travel on any road, if I lower the music volume and pay attention, I can hear the soft tinkling of the small bell. And sometimes, just sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I swear I can hear something else. A faint whispering that seems to come from the back seat, always stopping when I turn to look. If you spend as much time on the road as I do, you end up hearing all kinds of stories. Some drivers swear they've crossed paths with ghosts. Others speak of dark legends involving accidents. But what I experienced one night a few years ago still gives me chills down my spine. It was one of those long hauls, transporting construction materials from Portland to Seattle. The weather was calm, the road practically deserted, and everything seemed to be going well except for one thing. My fuel gauge was dropping far too quickly. I had calculated that the fuel would last until the next major station, but something was wrong. I thought the gauge might be malfunctioning, but I preferred not to risk it. That's when I noticed an old sign, already consumed by rust, with the words "Gas Station 2 miles." This intrigued me because I knew this stretch well and didn't remember there being a station there. Despite this, I decided to follow the indicated detour. When I arrived, the place was exactly what I'd imagined upon seeing the sign small, with 2 old gas pumps and a modest store to the side. The strangest thing, however, was that there was no one around. I got out of the truck, looked around, and even shouted, hoping someone would appear. Nothing. I only found a handwritten note attached to the store door that read, "Back soon." I waited a while near the truck, but the atmosphere was strange. The silence was so profound, it seemed unreal. Not even the sound of crickets broke that emptiness. Then I heard something, a dry noise, as if something was being dragged, coming from the bathrooms at the back of the station. I'm not one to be easily frightened, but a shiver ran up my spine. I thought someone might be hurt, so I went to check. As I approached, I saw that one of the bathroom doors was ajar, swinging slightly as if someone was inside. I called out asking if everything was all right, but no response came. I pushed the door carefully, and as soon as I entered, a terrible sensation enveloped me. The place was absurdly cold. It wasn't a normal cold, but one of those that seems to dig straight into your bones. And what really made me uncomfortable were the marks on the mirror, handprints, as if someone had pressed against the glass with force. But those marks weren't normal. They were thin and elongated, with a shape that didn't seem remotely human. I didn't waste time trying to understand what they were. I left hurriedly and went straight back to the truck. As soon as I got in, I tried to start the engine, but it simply didn't respond. I turned the key again, and nothing. It was as if the battery had died for no reason at all. By this point, my nervousness was taking over. I looked in the rear-view mirrors, expecting to see someone or something, but everything around remained empty. It was then that I felt that presence, that unmistakable sensation that someone was watching me. I didn't immediately spot it, but I knew something was there. And when I finally looked toward the store, I saw a dark figure, completely motionless, standing next to the door. I couldn't distinguish a face or details. It was just a tall, black silhouette that seemed to be staring fixedly at me. I don't know where I found the courage, but I tried the key one more time. The engine finally roared to life, and I wasted no time. I engaged the gear and got out of there as fast as I could, as if my life depended on it. I only looked back when I was at a good distance from the station. The figure was still there, in the same place, motionless, observing as before. What chilled me to the bone was that it seemed to be slightly moving its head, following my truck as it disappeared down the road. Hours later, I arrived at another gas station. My body was trembling when I got out of the truck, and the first thing I did was enter the restaurant and order a coffee, trying to calm myself down. There were other truckers at the counter, and after some time, I gathered the courage to tell them what had happened. One of them, an older man, stopped eating as soon as I started talking. His eyes turned serious, and he interrupted me to ask, "Was it that station on the detour before mile 40?" I confirmed with a nod, and he just shook his head as if he already knew what was coming. He explained that the place had been closed for more than 10 years. The owner disappeared mysteriously, along with several drivers who had stopped there. Nobody knows what really happened, but since then, no one stops at that station. What disturbed me even more was when he said that the last person who had reported seeing a dark figure there was found 3 days later, wandering along the highway, his skin ice cold despite the summer heat, repeating over and over, "It's still watching me." To this day, I have no idea what I encountered that night, but since then, I always make sure to fuel up before facing deserted roads. I never again trusted unknown gas stations, especially ones that appear where they shouldn't be. Hello to all. I hope you're well. I'd like to share a story that came to mind recently after the passing of my grandmother a few days ago. However, it's about something that happened to my great-grandmother. She passed away at 99 years of age from natural causes after living a long life in Salem, Massachusetts, near Gallows Hill. She had resided in the same house since she was 5 years old, a place that resembled a small village more than a home, with rooms scattered around a central courtyard, and the bathroom located on the other side of the space. When I was about 10 years old, I heard this story for the first time directly from my great-grandmother. She told me that she was only 15 when she began facing difficulties sleeping. Many times, she would get up during the early hours to walk through the walled courtyard of her house, which had a gate. On one of these nights, she decided to bring a chair to the courtyard to sit and wait for sleep to come. The only light present was that of the moon. It was then that she noticed something strange: the shadow of a tall, very thin male figure standing by the gate. Immediately, she stood up and walked toward the figure, believing it might just be the shadow of some object creating an illusion. However, the closer she got, the more distinct it became. Finally, she saw clearly. It really was a man. He stared at her fixedly, and suddenly he smiled. My great-grandmother said that at that instant, she entered a state of torpor and remembered nothing more. Hours later, one of her sisters woke up to go to the bathroom, crossing the courtyard. It was she who found my great-grandmother unconscious near the gate. Frightened, she called for help. Her mother and another sister came immediately and took her back to her room. At that time, only women lived in the house, as their father had died years before in a boating accident. Upon examining her, they noticed a strange mark on her neck, but no one could identify what might have caused it. Although they tried to ignore the occurrence so as not to succumb to fear, something curious happened. From that day on, my great-grandmother, who previously suffered from insomnia, began sleeping peacefully. However, this came accompanied by a new peculiarity. She became a sleepwalker. In the middle of the night, she would begin walking through the courtyard while asleep, without being conscious of what she was doing. Upon waking, she had no memory of how she had gotten there. This behavior repeated about 3 times a week, and as her sisters slept in separate rooms, they often didn't notice what was happening. Shortly after, my great-grandmother noticed the emergence of new marks on her body, similar to bites, spread across her arms, ankles, and neck. Strangely, she never reported what was happening to her mother or sisters, as if something prevented her from talking about it. Additionally, her health began to deteriorate. She started fainting frequently, felt exhausted, drowsy, and her appetite decreased considerably. During this period, she began constantly dreaming of that man she had seen on the first night. In her dreams, he seemed different. He was a young man of approximately 25, very well-dressed, attractive, who always appeared entering her room. She described the man as someone with a striking appearance, extremely pale skin, tall, with brown hair and dark brown eyes. His posture was elegant, and he exuded an intense, almost hypnotic perfume with an irresistible aroma. In her dreams, my great-grandmother saw how he would stay at the entrance of the room for a while, just watching her sleep. Then he would slowly approach, caressing her face, sliding his fingers through her hair, and finally kissing her cheek. My great-grandmother felt deeply attracted to him. It was more than attraction, a mixture of passion and fascination that bordered on obsession. Inexplicably, she said that without a single word spoken, he managed to communicate with her, as if his thoughts were transmitted directly to her mind. He would say that soon he would take her to live by his side, that it wouldn't be long before they would be together forever. And completely enchanted, she would agree, saying that she wanted to go, that she wanted to be with him and live in his house forever. Whenever she woke up after these dreams, she would find herself in the courtyard. In silence, she would return to her room and try to sleep again. During the day, she couldn't stop thinking about that man. She said that even awake, she felt she was in love, a passion that seemed real. Curiously, his perfume remained in her room like a persistent reminder of his presence. This strange and disturbing cycle lasted about 2 months until, in the early hours one morning, her mother, getting up to go to the bathroom, noticed something strange near the gate. There was my great-grandmother in the arms of a man who was kissing her neck. Indignant, the mother ran toward the two, thinking her daughter had secretly brought some young man home. However, as she approached, she witnessed a scene she would never forget. The man wasn't just kissing her daughter, he was biting her neck. Horrified, she shouted, "What are you doing?" The man turned to her, and it was then that she noticed something frightening. Fangs were coming out of his mouth, and there seemed to be blood dripping from them. The mother began to scream, calling her other daughters. In panic, she ran back to the room, while my great-grandmother's sisters came running out of their rooms, alerted by the screams. They saw the man flee from the house with a supernatural movement, jumping over the wall as if defying the laws of physics. My great-grandmother, meanwhile, continued standing near the gate, still in a state of sleepwalking. The mother returned with a rosary and a cross in hand. She recounted that while she prayed, the man seemed disturbed by the sounds, and upon noticing the sister's movement, he quickly escaped. Carefully, she took my great-grandmother back to the room, fearing to wake her, as she knew that waking a sleepwalker could be dangerous. She laid her on the bed, and upon examining her, noticed several bites spread across her body. But the most impressive was on her neck, where there wasn't even a drop of blood. The following morning, my great-grandmother's mother went to the old church in Salem in search of help. She sought a woman known as Madame Aliner. who had a reputation for performing spiritual cleansing works. When Madame Alina arrived at the house, she heard the mother's account, but without details about the dreams. After assessing the situation, she said something that gave everyone chills: by the marks on the body, by the peculiar smell that even she could sense in the environment, and by what was described, it was clear that what followed my great-grandmother was a vampire. Madame Alina, without having prior knowledge of the details, looked at my great-grandmother and directly asked, "Do you feel something for him, child? You asked him to take you, didn't you? And you allowed him to enter your house." It was as if these words unlocked something in my great-grandmother. Suddenly, she remembered an episode that seemed to have been erased until that moment. She recalled a day not long before when she was returning home after buying bread. Upon opening the gate, she saw the man for the first time on the other side of the narrow street. He smiled at her and, to her surprise, pronounced her name, a name my great-grandmother never wanted to reveal to me. At that moment, he asked with a serene voice if he could offer her a glass of water. And she, as if she had known him for years, as if an inexplicable trust had been established between them, responded with a smile, "Of course, come in. I'll bring it to you." She went to the kitchen to get the water, but upon returning to the courtyard, he was no longer there. Confused, she closed the gate and continued with her routine, trying to forget the occurrence. In telling this to Madame Alina, she also confessed that yes, she felt attracted to him in a way that caused her shame. It was a kind of emotional and physical dependency that she couldn't control, an irresistible desire to be near him. Madame Alina explained that this was the strategy of vampires, to seduce their victims to be able to take them. My great-grandmother's mother, although skeptical, admitted to believing in witches and shapeshifters, but in vampires, never. However, she recognized the danger and decided to follow all of Madame Alina's guidelines to protect her daughter. Madame Alina warned that if they didn't take the necessary measures, the vampire would end up taking my great-grandmother in a short time. So she gave a series of instructions. They should place certain plants in the courtyard, perform a special prayer every night before sleeping, and my great-grandmother needed to take baths with specific herbs. Additionally, she gave an amulet prepared especially for her that should be worn at all times without ever being removed. In the nights that followed, disturbing things began to happen. Knocks echoed from outside the gate, as if someone was trying to enter. My great-grandmother recounted that she heard her name being called repeatedly. The voice asked her to remove the amulet and come out. The perfume that hypnotized her was always present, making her even more vulnerable. As a precaution, she began sleeping in her mother's room. Despite this, on various occasions, she would rise while asleep and try to leave, although she never reached the courtyard. She would enter a kind of trance, struggling to tear the amulet from her own body. The days that followed were complicated, but as the months passed, everything returned to normal. Madame Alina assured that the vampire had moved away, that he probably wouldn't return as long as the guidelines were followed to the letter. The main one being never, under any circumstances, to remove the amulet. My great-grandmother faithfully obeyed. With time, she recovered. However, the years brought the gradual loss of her memory, and she became increasingly reserved, speaking less as time passed. Still, when she had the strength, she would tell the story of the vampire who tried to take her. Even at 99 years old, she maintained the habit of bathing with the herbs recommended by Madame Aliner. In the house, the plants that protected the courtyard continued in the same place, and the rituals were maintained as a tradition of respect for what my great-grandmother believed. One of her greatest restrictions was regarding the amulet. She never allowed it to be photographed, saying that it wasn't something trivial or to be treated as a game. Out of respect for her wishes, none of us dared to disobey. When she passed away, the amulet was buried with her, despite some disagreements among family members. For many, it was a way to honor her memory and ensure her peace. The coffin was filled with the herbs she used in her baths, and a prayer was recited that she had taught us a month before she died. Rest in peace, great-grandmother. I need to say that I'm not someone who gets scared easily. With more than 2 decades behind the wheel of trucks, I've faced it all: intense storms, attempted robberies, and nearly impossible routes. Still, what I experienced a few years ago continues to intrigue me. Every time I remember it, I feel a shiver run down my spine. It was supposed to be just another routine trip, one of those you make without even thinking about it. I was transporting a load of automotive parts from Detroit to Buffalo, a route I know like the back of my hand. The night was calm and the highway deserted. I had already passed through the most complicated stretch, and only a few hours remained to my destination. That's when the fatigue began to weigh on me. I didn't want to stop, but I knew it would be imprudent to continue driving that way. When I spotted a rest area in the distance, I decided to pull over. The place didn't seem familiar to me, but it didn't cause any unease either. It was situated by the side of the road, with a small parking lot, a little shop, and 2 bathrooms at the back. The lights, though on, had a weak glow, as if they were about to go out. I parked the truck, turned off the engine, and got out to stretch my legs a bit. The first thing that caught my attention was the silence. There wasn't the typical sound of other trucks arriving or leaving, nor the buzz of radios playing, just an absolute emptiness. I thought that perhaps it was too late, and the other drivers were already sleeping. I decided to enter the shop to buy a coffee. I needed something to ward off sleep. Behind the counter was an elderly man. He barely raised his eyes when I entered, but there was something strange about his countenance. I can't say he seemed hostile, but his smile had something uncomfortable about it, as if it were forced, an attempt at sympathy that wasn't convincing. At the back of the place, 2 men were sitting at a table. They weren't talking, they weren't eating. They were just there, observing discreetly. After paying for the coffee, the attendant asked me a question that left me intrigued. "Are you traveling alone?" I laughed, a bit awkwardly, and confirmed with a yes. He stared at me for a few seconds, as if analyzing me before returning my change. That place had something wrong with it, although I couldn't explain what. When I returned to the truck, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. The passenger door was ajar. I always keep it locked, especially when I'm on the road. I considered that perhaps I had forgotten due to fatigue, but the situation seemed wrong. I quickly searched the cabin. Everything was as before, but that sensation that someone had been there didn't leave me. I started the truck, determined to get out of there as fast as possible. As I moved away from the rest area, I began to notice details that didn't make sense. The side mirrors were slightly out of position, as if someone had moved them, something I never fail to adjust before continuing a journey, so that bothered me. Additionally, there was a strange smell inside the cabin, something like sweat, but I knew it wasn't mine. I tried to push these thoughts away and focus on the road, but the sensation of discomfort persisted. Every time I looked at the mirrors, I felt that something was wrong. At a certain point, I had the impression of seeing something that shouldn't be there. It was quick, a fleeting reflection of something small, a shadow that disappeared almost immediately. I convinced myself it was just my eyes or the effects of the coffee, nothing more than my mind playing tricks. I decided that I needed a pause to get better and would stop at the next service station. When I arrived, the scene was more familiar, other trucks parked, the typical movement of other drivers, and that brought me some relief. I got out of the truck and entered the restaurant, but little did I know that things would get even stranger. A group of truckers was talking animatedly at one of the tables. With my coffee in hand, I approached, and one of them, an older gentleman, greeted me. We started to talk, and I don't know why, but I felt I could open up. I told them about the rest area, the attendant with strange behavior, the two men standing at the back doing nothing, and mentioned the open truck door and the misaligned mirrors. When I finished, the man turned serious and asked me exactly where the rest area was located. I explained the stretch of road with all the details, and upon hearing it, he made a worried expression that chilled me to the bone. "That place is known among us truckers," he said gravely. "We don't know exactly what happens there, but it's not a safe place. We don't believe in these stories of spirits or demons, but many people have disappeared after passing through there. Those men you saw, they're not there by accident." Another trucker who was listening to the conversation joined us and added a story that only increased the weight of that situation. He recounted that years ago, a friend of his stopped at this same rest area and never returned home. Days later, they found his truck abandoned miles away. The cargo was intact, but the trailer had scratch marks as if someone or something had tried to break in. What terrified me most was when a third trucker leaned in closer and whispered, "The worst part is, everyone who's disappeared after stopping there. Their trucks were found with the passenger door open." I didn't know what to think. Everything they told me seemed to make sense, but at the same time, it was hard to believe. Could it be something supernatural happening at that rest area? Or perhaps it was just people with bad intentions taking advantage of the isolation of the road. Neither of these possibilities was comforting. I returned to the truck with an uncomfortable sensation, as if something was out of place. I checked everything once more, mirrors, doors, the interior of the cabin. Everything was as it should be. But I couldn't shake the impression that someone had been there. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and continued my journey. But I couldn't avoid casting constant glances at the mirrors, as if expecting to find something. That night, I completed the route without any further incident, but the doubts accompanied me to my destination. When I arrived, I still couldn't sleep. What really happened at that rest area? Was it something supernatural, as some suggest, or just dangerous people taking advantage of the vulnerability of those passing by? To this day, I don't know the answer, and that uncertainty is what bothers me the most. On some nights during my trips, these memories return. I find myself thinking about what could have happened if I had remained there for longer, if I hadn't been cautious, or if I hadn't started the truck in time. I'll probably never have a definitive answer, but there's something the road has taught me. It doesn't matter if the danger is human or supernatural. It's always better to be alert. What seems common and harmless can hide traps, and the most valuable rule is to avoid stopping in unknown places, especially those that seem too quiet, too empty, or too convenient when you're exhausted on a deserted highway at night. During a car trip, I was crossing through Pennsylvania when fatigue began to take over. To avoid risks, I decided to stop in a small town called Millbrook. Looking for a place to spend the night, I ended up coming across a lodging called Millbrook Country Inn. The place had a decadent aspect, but to be honest, that seemed to be the standard for the entire town. All I wanted was a bed to rest, nothing fancy. I parked in the lot and headed to the reception office, a small space located in front of one of the motel's 2 blocks. Inside, an elderly gentleman was reading the newspaper, oblivious to my arrival. The environment was stuffy, and a desk fan made an incessant noise. I asked for a room, and he raised his eyes with disdain, still holding the newspaper. Without ceremony, he muttered, "$65. I interpreted that as the price for the night and handed over my credit card. I asked if it would be possible to stay in a corner room. The answer was short and harsh. No, there was no sign of courtesy in his service. In exchange for the payment, he gave me an old key hanging from a simple, unidentified keychain. No magnetic cards at that place. I crossed the empty parking lot until I reached my room. The door seemed to have a will of its own. I had to turn and adjust the key several times before managing to open it. Before entering, I observed the deserted courtyard with only 2 other cars parked. The town seemed abandoned, a true scene of neglect. When I finally entered the room, I was greeted by an unpleasant odor, a mixture of mold, and something else harder to identify, perhaps vomit. I considered going back to reception to ask for another room, but considering the general state of the motel, I imagined it wouldn't make any difference. The room was tiny. The worn and soiled blue carpet covered the floor. There was a worn-out sofa, a small center table, and a bed that seemed to have survived decades of use. I closed the door behind me, and when trying to lock it, found myself in an even worse battle than I had faced to open it. After minutes struggling with the lock and almost losing my patience, I realized that although the door wasn't properly locked, at least it wouldn't open anymore. I decided that this was good enough. I lay down on the bed, feeling the springs creaking under my weight, almost as if protesting. I reached for the remote to turn on the TV, but as I already suspected, it didn't work. Without many options, I wrapped myself in the blankets, trying to ignore the depressing environment, and closed my eyes to finally rest. That's when it happened. A sudden noise at the window made me almost jump out of bed. I looked startled and saw a man outside, appearing injured and desperate. He began to speak with a weak but insistent voice. "Hey, please let me in, I'm hurt. I need help." He clearly saw me lying on the bed. I responded by shouting for him to seek help at the reception, but he wouldn't give up. I was paralyzed by the sensation that this was an act, a trap. There wasn't any chance I would open the door for him. After a while, ignoring his pleas, he finally left. I waited a bit before confirming, and when I looked again, there was no more sign of him. It was only at that moment that I realized how unsafe that place was. I quickly got up to test the door lock. I gave it a few tugs to make sure it was firm, and satisfied with that, I closed the curtains to block the view from the windows. The last thing I wanted was for him to return. The scare affected me, but I managed to calm down in about half an hour. Eventually, I fell into a light sleep. During the little I slept, I had a bizarre dream. I was trapped in a deserted supermarket, being chased by the manager. In the middle of the dream, I began to hear repetitive sounds, a constant clicking that ended up taking over the oniric situation. It was this sound that awakened me. I woke up feeling a strange coldness in the room. I looked down and noticed that the blanket had been pulled away from me. I sat up a bit confused to pull it back, but that's when I noticed something that froze me at the foot of the bed. A tall figure was standing, staring at me. Before I could react, he said, in a strangely calm voice that only made it more terrifying, not to move or make noise, assuring that he wouldn't hurt me if I followed his instructions. With a firm voice, he asked where my wallet was. I swallowed hard and responded that it was in the pocket of the jeans thrown on the floor. Without taking his eyes off me, I saw that sinister figure move to my jeans, searching the pockets until he found what he was looking for. "What else do you have here?" he asked. I responded, trying to sound calm, "I'm just making a car trip." He said nothing more, took what he wanted, and left the room. As soon as he was gone, I jumped out of bed to try to lock the door again, facing the same difficulty as before. Then I called the police, but the response was slow and not very useful. With my nerves on edge, I went to reception to see the security camera images. The attendant played the video, but the intruder was masked and wearing a hat, making it impossible to identify any detail of his face. After recovering the little money I had in my wallet, I immediately left that place. I spent the night in the car, preferring discomfort to insecurity. The following morning, I canceled all my cards and promised myself never to stop at a motel that seemed suspicious again. What frightened me the most, though, was something I only realized weeks later when I was organizing the contents of my wallet. The intruder had taken my money and credit cards, but had left something else behind, a small business card tucked into one of the slots that I'm certain wasn't there before. It was for the Millbrook Country Inn, but the address on the card was for a location over 200 miles away from where I had stayed. When I searched online for information about the motel, I discovered that the real Millbrook Country Inn had burned down in a tragic fire 15 years ago. All guests and staff had perished in the blaze. The lesson was hard, but I'll never forget it. My name is Marcus, and I've been traveling the roads for more than 2 decades. I've never been one to believe in hauntings or anything supernatural. However, what I experienced a few years ago defied my reason. Even today, when I'm driving alone at night, the memory of that episode makes me feel a chill down my spine. It was one of those winter nights when frost seems to invade your bones. I had just completed a delivery in a village near the Canadian border. and was returning home with an empty trailer. The journey wasn't long, and I imagined that at that hour I would find the road clear. All I wanted was to get home soon and rest. At first, everything went as expected. The road was completely deserted. No headlights, no movement, just emptiness. The wind howled, and the sound echoed through the trailer, creating that kind of noise I was already accustomed to. But after a sharp curve, I heard a sound that made me grip the steering wheel harder. It was a dry thud coming from the trailer, as if something heavy had fallen inside. I thought it was just the trailer reacting to some unevenness in the asphalt. Shortly after came another noise, even louder, followed by what sounded like footsteps. I decided to pull over to the shoulder to check. I grabbed my flashlight, got out of the truck, and went to the trailer. The door was locked, the padlock intact, exactly as I had left it. I opened the door, illuminated the interior, and saw nothing but the cold, metallic walls that amplified the sounds. I took a deep breath, closed everything again, and returned to the road, convinced they were just common noises. However, the sounds persisted. With each mile, the footsteps inside the trailer became more distinct, walking from one side to the other. Soon another sound emerged, a light touch on the wall, as if someone was gently tapping inside. I turned up the volume on the radio to drown it out, but it didn't help. The most terrifying moment happened when I looked in the rearview mirror. My blood froze upon seeing a handprint in the dust on the trailer. It was impossible to ignore. I had checked the trailer myself before leaving, and it was absolutely clean. But now the impression of a hand was there, clear as day, seeming to come from inside to outside. With no choice, I stopped again. With my heart racing, I got out of the truck once more, feeling the air around me charged with a presence I couldn't comprehend. When I opened the trailer, the flashlight revealed the same emptiness as before. But this time there was something new on the floor, distinct footprints, as if someone had walked there. I closed the door forcefully, trying to push away the growing fear that was consuming me. I repeated to myself that everything had a logical explanation. Perhaps the marks were old, or something that had simply escaped me in the first inspection. I returned to the wheel, but now it was impossible to focus. My eyes were glued to the mirrors, fearing to see something that shouldn't be there. The sounds persisted, and now they were even worse. They weren't just noises anymore. They were strong knocks, almost desperate, as if something or someone was trapped in there, struggling to get out. Then I heard what I will never forget, a whisper. It was low, difficult to catch, but unmistakable. I couldn't decipher the words, but the voice seemed weak, exhausted, as if begging for something. At that moment, panic took over. I pressed my foot on the accelerator, wanting only to reach the nearest town. The idea of discovering what was happening was unbearable. But as if that wasn't enough, the truck began to behave strangely. The transmission seemed heavier, and the vehicle was losing power despite being empty. I checked the indicators, and everything was normal. Still, the sensation of dragging tons didn't leave me. After what seemed like an eternity, I spotted the lights of a small village and pulled into a roadside diner where truckers usually take a break. As soon as I got out of the truck, I felt as if something invisible had been lifted off me. I went inside, ordered a coffee, and sat down, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions Some colleagues were there, and among them was Richard, a longtime friend. He noticed something was wrong, and with initial reluctance, I ended up sharing everything that had happened. At first he laughed, thinking I was simply exhausted. However, when I mentioned the handprints and the whispers, his expression changed completely. A heavy silence hung between us before he spoke something that only increased my unease. "That trailer carries a heavy history," Richard said seriously. He told me about a tragic incident involving that same trailer years ago. A family fleeing from a home invasion had hidden in the trailer, thinking it was a safe place. The driver, unaware that they were there, locked the trailer and drove for hours across the state. When he finally opened it at his destination, he found them dead. A mother, father, and 2 small children all succumbed to the extreme cold of that winter night. Since then, several drivers who used the trailer reported strange phenomena, inexplicable sounds, murmurs, and that unusual sensation of weight that made driving more difficult. Richard suggested I return the trailer and not think about it anymore. That night, I didn't have the courage to go back to the truck. I slept at the diner, and at dawn, I took the trailer straight to the depot. I handed it over without giving any explanation. I just wanted to get rid of it. Since then, every time I pass through that route, the memory returns. Maybe it was just nervousness, fatigue, or a combination of both. But I can never forget those handprints in the dust, so clear, as if someone was begging to get out. What truly disturbs me to this day is that I later learned the trailer was scrapped after multiple drivers refused to haul it. Before it was destroyed, the depot manager examined it one last time and found something chilling: dozens of small handprints frozen into the metal walls, only visible when the temperature dropped below freezing. Handprints of children pointing toward the doors, as if they were trying to escape. There are things in life that defy any attempt at understanding, and I believe that night I encountered something that I shouldn't have. Today, every strange noise in the truck leaves me on alert, and I can't avoid checking the mirrors. I just hope I never again cross paths with an empty trailer like that one. I want to begin by saying that I've always been drawn to ghost stories and local legends. Many of them seem quite similar across different cultures, with common figures and themes weaving through the fabric of our collective fears. The story I'm about to share involves something I experienced firsthand: an encounter with the enigmatic woman in white, a presence that appears in many accounts, but which makes me wonder, do we all see the same woman, or is she merely a manifestation of something more personal and close to us? My story happened in 2013, when I was just 9 years old. At that time, my great-grandfather on my mother's side was fighting a hard battle against cancer, which he unfortunately lost. 2 years earlier, my great-grandmother had died from a heart attack, and we believed that loneliness and grief consumed him more quickly than the disease. It seemed he simply wanted to pass on to reunite with her. During the final months of my great-grandfather's life, his youngest daughter, my great-aunt Laura, who lived outside Boston, had to return to be closer to the family. She had 2 small children, a girl and a boy. Whenever my great-aunt spent the night at the hospital caring for her father, the children stayed with a relative or at my great-grandfather's house itself, but never alone, always accompanied by an adult. I should mention that my great-grandfather's house had a very peculiar atmosphere. To this day, anyone who enters feels a strange weight, something uncomfortable. The further you advance toward the back of the house, the denser the environment seems to become. I don't know if it's fear, anxiety, or a mixture of both, but I'm not the only one who feels it. Several people have commented that there's something negative in that place, as if a dark energy dwells there. Back then, some of my great-grandfather's grandchildren and granddaughters, my second cousins, children of my mother's siblings, took turns watching the house during the night to prevent possible break-ins. My mother was part of this group, and one of those nights, I insisted she take me with her. I didn't want to spend the night at my grandmother's house. My mother was reluctant at first, but eventually gave in, and so we went together to spend the night there. Since childhood, I've always had difficulty sleeping. I'm more active at night and have a hard time waking up early, which of course was no different that day. My mother is one of those people who falls asleep as soon as her head hits the pillow. That night, it was just the two of us in the house. At that time, modern smartphones didn't exist, and my only companion while I was awake were my own thoughts. I spent hours lying there, staring at the ceiling in the midst of darkness. We were in the main bedroom, where the double bed was pushed against one of the walls. I was lying down looking at the ceiling while my mother slept to my left, turned toward me. The hours dragged on in the darkness, and I began to feel a slight discomfort, as if something was about to appear and frighten me. Perhaps they were just the thoughts of an impressionable child, but to my surprise, what I imagined wasn't so far from happening. I believe it was already past midnight, perhaps between 2 and 3 in the morning, when to the right side of the bed, very close to where my mother was, a light began to form. At first, it was just a soft glow that gradually increased, as if someone was adjusting the intensity. In about 5 to 8 seconds, the light became completely visible, revealing something that left me speechless. A woman began to take shape, where before there was only light. From the height at which she appeared, I imagine she must have been kneeling beside the bed, as I could only see the upper part of her body. Her skin was extremely pale and shone with intensity, as if emanating its own light. She wore something similar to a white nightgown, the kind women used to wear for sleeping in times past. Her hair was long, straight, and black, with bangs that completely covered her eyes. I couldn't see her gaze, but even so, there was something extraordinary about her beauty. After about 5 seconds, the figure disappeared in the same way she had appeared, fading slowly until only darkness remained. I was deeply impacted, but didn't react. I remained motionless, without speaking, screaming, or even waking my mother. I just lay there, processing what I had just witnessed. A few minutes later, I closed my eyes and somehow managed to sleep until dawn. The next day, I told my mother what I had seen. She seemed both surprised and skeptical. She said she preferred not to believe in such things, and suggested I forget about the incident. Sometime later, something happened that seemed to confirm that the house held more secrets than we wanted to admit. My mother and my great-aunt Laura were alone there, talking calmly. It was a period when my great-grandfather had already passed away for several months, and my great-aunt had moved back to Boston. The two were in the dining room, which was close to the back part of the house, when something unexpected happened. Suddenly, coming from that dark back area of the house, they clearly heard a voice that both recognized immediately. The voice called out, "Laura." Instinctively, my great-aunt responded, "Yes, Dad." It was only after responding that she and my mother realized what they had just heard. They looked at each other, perplexed, sharing the same thought. It can't be, he's dead. Without thinking twice, they got up and ran out of the house, overcome with fear. I don't know exactly what they discussed afterward, but years later, my mother remembered that episode and approached me to ask, "Honey, do you still remember that time you saw a woman in white at Aunt Laura's house?" I told my mother that, of course, I remembered very well what had happened. It was then that she began to tell me something she had never shared before. When you insisted on going with me to watch the house, I hesitated because on previous nights I had experienced strange things. I always ended up arguing with the kids because in the morning I would find everything out of place and the bathroom faucet open, pouring water nonstop. And it wasn't just that. Other cousins commented about the 4 rocking chairs on the porch. They swore that at night, only one of the chairs would rock, while the others remained motionless, which ruled out the possibility of it being the wind. It was as if someone was sitting there. My mother paused before continuing. So when it was my turn to stay there again, and this time without the children, the same mess appeared in the morning. The faucet was open again, despite no one else being in the house besides me. Who could I blame? I prefer to think it was your great-grandmother visiting us, but what really frightened me and your Aunt Laura happened a few months later. She explained that after that night, when she and my great-aunt heard what seemed to be my great-grandfather's voice, the two began to open up about the subject. Despite it being something difficult to admit, it was impossible to ignore. My mother decided to tell my great-aunt about what I had seen. To her surprise, my great-aunt responded that her younger daughter had also talked about a woman dressed in white. Like my mother, she hadn't paid much attention, believing it was just an imaginary friend. According to the girl, this woman in white wore cowboy-style boots and appeared standing up. After that conversation, my great-aunt decided to investigate the family tree. She wanted to discover if there was any woman who had already died and who matched the description: pale skin, long black hair, and a white dress. She searched through old photographs, going further and further back in time until she found something. A photo of my great-great-grandmother, my great-grandmother's mother. She was the only one who matched the description, or at least looked very similar. Since then, many in the family decided to believe it was really her. And even today, this idea still persists among us. Reflecting on all this, I remembered that at the moment I saw that figure, I didn't feel fear or threat. The sensation was more of surprise, but never danger. I even managed to fall asleep shortly afterward, in a deep and peaceful sleep. To this day, other people claim to have seen the mysterious woman in white in that house as well. They continue to talk about the dense and heavy energy that emanates from the back of the property, as if something dark is still present. Personally, I like to think it was really my great-great-grandmother. If she didn't cause me terror, perhaps she was there to protect us. Who knows if her presence was a way to ward off the darkness of that house, that strange force that knocked over plates, scattered objects, and opened the faucets every night, as it still does to this day. What surprises me most is that I've since learned that woman in white legends exist across numerous cultures, yet the descriptions vary widely. In our family's case, seeing her wasn't a harbinger of doom or a frightening omen, as many myths suggest, but rather a comforting presence. I've often wondered if these apparitions are truly the same entity across all sightings, or if they're simply manifestations of our collective need to believe that those we've lost still watch over us, appearing in forms that our minds can process and accept. Whatever the truth may be, I know what I saw that night was real, at least to me, and that memory remains as vivid now as it was when I was 9 years old. Early last summer, my father and I embarked on a journey to volunteer our help in a village that had been devastated by recent wildfires. We loaded up a pickup truck with clothes and various donations to assist the families in rebuilding their lives. On the first night, we stayed at a hotel with a stunning view of the mountains. We spent the night watching the Blair Witch Project on my laptop using the free Wi-Fi. The result, a poorly slept night with my imagination in overdrive. On the second night, my mother reserved a room for us at a motel, as our stay ended up being extended. The place was located about 100 yards from a trailer park and had a beautiful view of a large lake. The property was isolated, surrounded by trees, and the choice was made due to lack of options. According to my mother, all the other places were booked. There, we met the 2 people responsible for the motel. The manager, an elderly woman, was very kind and explained everything we needed to know, including the peculiarity that the lake had been empty for 2 decades. Her husband, on the other hand, had an appearance that directly reminded me of a horror movie villain. He didn't say a word to us, nor did he show any sign of sympathy. His face, marked by wrinkles, seemed to melt, and deep dark circles surrounded his eyes, creating a disturbing figure. My father and I began to feel a growing discomfort. The rest of the day passed in the blink of an eye, and we decided to have pizza for dinner and watch a movie to delay our return to the motel as much as possible. When we finally returned, it was already pitch dark. Opening the back of the pickup to get our things, we found a bag full of children's clothes hidden under the spare tire. We thought perhaps it could be useful to someone in the trailer park and decided to take it there. However, something made me hesitate. Maybe the effect of the horror movie we had watched the night before. A story about young people who encountered a witch in the forest. We ended up deciding to take the bag to the motel reception and ask the strange manager if he could deliver it to the families in the park. When we explained our idea, his eyes widened. He shook his head vehemently and said only, "No, no way. I don't go there." Then he walked away without further explanation. My father and I exchanged glances, both clearly thinking, what was that? We opted to leave the bag in a donation box when we returned home. After a quick shower, we went to bed. I remember waking up at 2:17 in the morning, interrupted by my father's loud snoring. Unable to sleep, I picked up my cell phone and began reading a book, lying facing the door. While reading, I heard the sound of cars accelerating outside. I decided to ignore it, thinking it was just some people having fun around there. My belief that everything was fine crumbled the moment I noticed an intense blue light escaping through the cracks in the door, both at the top and bottom. At the same time, low and indecipherable whispers came from the other side. Fear completely dominated me. I was paralyzed, feeling my heart pulsing in my throat while my hands trembled uncontrollably. It was then that I heard the doorknob start to rattle, and at that moment, I was certain that something bad was about to happen. Suddenly, the light disappeared, and an absolute silence took over the room. I remained motionless, frozen with fear, for what must have been about 3 minutes, but seemed like an eternity. Finally, I gathered the courage to wake my father and tell him what had just happened. He reacted with a nervous laugh and explained that earlier that night, he had also experienced something strange. He couldn't sleep because of scratching sounds coming from the walls right next to our bed. Not quite understanding, I questioned if he was joking, but he just put his finger to his lips and whispered, "SHH." Did you hear that? The room fell into an unsettling silence until suddenly, a sound of short scratches came from the bed frame. I jumped from where I was and told him we needed to get out of there immediately. There was no room for debate. We left the key on top of the bed and ran to the pickup. The clock marked 2:32 in the morning when we departed. We drove for about an hour before finding a 24-hour diner where we could collect ourselves. While nursing cups of coffee, my father confessed something that made my blood run cold. "I didn't want to scare you back there," he said, "but when I got up to use the bathroom earlier, I saw something moving outside our window. It looked like a person, but not quite. Something was off about it, like it wasn't completely solid." When we eventually made it home the next day, I did some research on that motel. What I discovered sent shivers down my spine. 30 years ago, a family of 4 had been murdered in room 12, our room. According to local legend, their spirits appear as blue lights, seeking help from guests to find justice. The most disturbing detail: the father was found with deep scratch marks all over his body, as if he had been attacked by something with claws. Under no circumstances will I ever go near that motel again. And if I ever hear scratching sounds coming from inside the walls, I won't wait to investigate. I'll be gone before whatever's making those sounds decides to reveal itself. There's something both fascinating and terrifying about how certain events can leave their mark on people and the places they inhabit. Often stories about the supernatural carry a weight that makes us question the line between reality and imagination. That's exactly what makes this story so haunting. I decided to share this experience because it completely changed my perspective on what might exist beyond what we can see. Working at Providence Memorial Hospital in Portland, Oregon had always given me satisfaction. The facility was widely recognized for its excellence and the incredible dedication of its staff. I've been a nurse for over 20 years, but among all the memories I've accumulated over the years, there's one night that remains vivid in my mind. A night that profoundly changed my life and the hospital's history. It happened exactly 7 years ago, on a rainy October night. During my shift, they brought in an emergency patient named Ethan Garsha. He was an enigmatic figure, famous for leading a religious cult surrounded by controversies and scandals due to his unconventional practices. I had read reports and watched programs that pointed to the strange rituals of his organization. involving esoteric elements and beliefs that I simply couldn't comprehend. Mr. Garsha arrived in critical condition, and the entire team was on alert while the attending physician worked to keep him alive. However, something disturbing happened around 3:33 in the morning. We were engaged in desperate efforts to stabilize him, when suddenly all the lights in the hospital went out. The sound of medical equipment shutting down echoed through the room, creating an atmosphere of pure terror. We were gripped by panic, unable to understand what was happening. The scenario became even more frightening when a kind of cold shadow seemed to cover the entire hospital. I looked at my colleagues and saw fear etched on every face. In the midst of the chaos and darkness, Mr. Garsha died. His death was so quiet it almost went unnoticed. But something about him left a deep and disturbing impression on me that night. There was something unnatural about him, something I can't clearly express. After that incident, the hospital was never the same. Strange events began to surface. Patients who were ready for discharge died inexplicably, suffered cardiac or respiratory arrests without apparent cause, or their clinical conditions suddenly worsened, becoming irreversible. I remember as if it were yesterday the first case. A young man recovering from a simple surgery who was about to go home. However, we found him dead in his bed, without any plausible medical explanation. His eyes were wide open, and his mouth was gaping. The strangest detail was the marks scattered across his body, especially in the neck and chest region. It looked as if he had been attacked by some invisible, inexplicable force. There was no logic to it, no explanation we could give. The morning after the young man's death, we gathered in the monitoring room to analyze recordings from the security cameras in the common areas. Nothing could have prepared us for what we saw in the images. The young patient who was about to be released appeared calm, sitting in a chair in the waiting room, looking at his phone. But then, abruptly, the recording experienced interference. The screen went dark for a few seconds. When the image returned, the young man was already on the floor, convulsing, grabbing his own neck as if something invisible was choking him. He struggled, trying to escape, but seemed to be dragged by an invisible force to an area outside the camera's range. We watched petrified as he was tormented until his body went still. Silence took over the control room. No one could even formulate words. The horror of what we had just witnessed froze us. The hospital administration decided to cover up the incident internally. They chose to inform the family that the young man had suffered a sudden medical complication, something impossible to predict or prevent. However, those of us who watched the images knew the truth. Something evil was present in the hospital, and no one knew how to deal with it. I decided to seek answers on my own. Upon investigating, I discovered that Ethan Garsha's death had been surrounded by equally strange circumstances. The blackout, the equipment failure, and the unusual behavior of the doctors who participated in the attempt to save him were indications of something greater. Many of them even resigned shortly after the event. It was at that moment that I came to a terrible conclusion. The spirit of Ethan, that leader of obscure practices, seemed to be behind the nightmare we were living. Something dark and powerful had remained trapped among us. I tried to alert my superiors, but my warnings were ignored. Nights at the hospital began to carry an unbearable weight. Once tranquil corridors became sources of whispers and voices that came from nowhere. Several times I perceived a fleeting figure crossing the corridors rapidly. But at first, I thought it was just my imagination. This impression changed when other colleagues also began to report similar experiences. One night during rounds, I experienced something I'll never forget. I was walking down a silent corridor when a shadow slid in front of me and disappeared into one of the rooms. I imagined it might be a confused patient and decided to check. However, upon entering, I found no one. The environment was inexplicably cold, and I had the unmistakable sensation that someone was watching me. Despite being unsettled, I forced myself to continue. However, throughout my rounds, I felt as if an invisible presence was lurking, following me closely. Later, when passing through a service area, something even more terrifying happened. I noticed a shadow moving quickly into a dark corner. My heart raced, and a feeling of profound dread took over me. With hesitation, I turned in the direction it had gone and immediately stopped. It was as if something was watching me with almost tangible intensity. As I slowly turned around, there it was, a figure composed of indistinct shadows, as if the very reality around it was distorted. Its presence exuded an inexplicable terror, as if all the evils in the world were concentrated in that instant. A peculiar odor of dampness, mixed with something putrid, filled the air. My body became paralyzed, unable to react or even scream. Suddenly, something invisible and icy grabbed my ankles with tremendous force. The pull was so violent that it knocked me to the ground. I tried to scream, but my voice seemed smothered, unable to break the silence around me. Before I could react, I was dragged by this brutal force, feeling every impact against the floor as if my body was being torn apart. Pain completely overtook me, my vision blurred, and soon darkness enveloped me. When I regained consciousness, I was in an unfamiliar room, surrounded by shadows so dense that it seemed impossible for light to exist there. My entire body throbbed with pain, and my mind struggled to comprehend what had happened. The terror continued pulsing uncontrollably. I tried to move, but my muscles barely responded. Even without seeing anything, I knew I wasn't alone. I felt a presence around me, something hidden, observing every movement with oppressive attention. My heart was racing as I tried to locate any exit, any sign of light that could guide me out of that nightmare. With great effort, I managed to stand up, using the wall as support. Each breath was an effort, each step a battle against crushing fear. In the silence, I heard something that froze my blood, a hoarse murmur coming from somewhere behind me. "You won't escape," the voice echoed, laden with resentment and despair. In a survival impulse, I gathered the last strength I had left and ran for the door. The pain burned through my body, but the fear was greater. When I managed to open the door, the light from the corridor hit me like a blow. I stumbled, fell, but continued to run, not looking back, focused only on getting away from that darkness and the presence that had almost consumed me. I only stopped when I reached the control room, where my colleagues were. Their faces mixed surprise and concern when I tried to tell them what had happened. But their incredulous looks only reinforced the feeling of isolation that consumed me. We knew that something truly evil had been awakened in that hospital, something that had manifested after Ethan Garsha's death. The inexplicable deaths of patients were impossible to ignore evidence, although we couldn't understand why some were affected and others weren't. That was the breaking point. We could no longer pretend that what was happening was coincidence or imagination. It was time to act. In secret, we organized a plan. One night, a group of doctors and nurses gathered in the break room. We had contacted Father Paul, a priest known for his experience in exorcisms and purification rituals. One of the doctors had worked with him before, during the case of a young woman who, according to reports, was possessed. When the priest arrived at the hospital, the weight of the situation was evident in his countenance. Despite maintaining a calm demeanor, his eyes reflected a deep concern. "We need to act quickly," he said firmly. "The energy in this place is heavy, suffocating. Something very ancient and evil is here. The sectarian leader's death triggered something that already existed, something that has now strengthened. We must bless every corner of this hospital and face the evils we find." With these words, we prepared to traverse the corridors, carrying with us the hope that this ritual could dissipate the darkness that had taken hold of the place. We divided into small groups and began to cross the hospital corridors, sprinkling holy water while chanting prayers. At first, the environment seemed calm, but as we advanced, the temperature dropped drastically. An abnormal cold took over the place, so freezing that it seemed to penetrate to the bones. Fear infiltrated us like an invisible shadow. Suddenly, all the hospital lights abruptly went out, plunging us into complete darkness. The muffled sound of Father Paul's prayers and the nervous murmurs of my colleagues were the only echoes in the oppressive silence. Then the chaos began. Objects started flying through the corridors, as if an invisible force was angrily throwing them against walls and floors. Medication carts, surgical instruments, and boxes were launched with supernatural violence, creating a scene of pure despair. The noise was deafening, a mix of bangs, shatters, and muffled screams. The sensation of a malignant presence became unbearable, increasingly close and palpable. Panic overtook the group. Some colleagues fled, stumbling in the darkness, their screams echoing through the corridors. Despite the terror, I tried to maintain calm and followed Father Paul. But it was almost impossible to control the growing fear. "Don't stop praying," he shouted, his voice trembling but firm. Suddenly, I was pushed by an invisible force and fell violently to the floor. The sound of glass breaking and objects colliding around me seemed to mix with my own despair. It was as if cold, incorporeal hands were touching my skin, filling me with a sensation of absolute dread. With effort, I managed to get up, along with the few colleagues who still remained. We ran toward the exit without looking back. Father Paul remained determined to finish the blessing, facing that terrifying force alone. When he finally emerged from the hospital, his state was alarming. He trembled uncontrollably, his face pale and his eyes revealing a deep, almost insane fear. He took out a small bottle of alcohol from inside his cassock and took a long gulp, his hands still trembling. I never imagined seeing a priest that way. "There's nothing like this," he murmured with a choked voice and lost eyes. "This is pure evil." Without further words, He cast us one last look that reflected the same terror we felt. Then he quickly moved away, leaving us alone with the terrible realization that the hospital harbored something incomprehensible, something that seemed impossible to defeat. After that night and the failed attempt to bless the hospital, things got even worse. The atmosphere became suffocating, almost unbearable. One by one, the staff began to resign. Working there became impossible. I was one of the last to leave, trying to understand what had triggered such terror. Something in that place seemed to trap us while slowly destroying us. There was something indescribable about the evil energy that permeated the hospital. It wore us down physically and mentally, making each day more difficult to continue. Working in that place was no longer an option. It was like fighting against something that fed on our fear and our presence. Gradually, our health, our sanity, and even our will to resist deteriorated. Rumors about the supernatural events spread like wildfire, forever ruining the hospital's reputation. Little by little, patients began to avoid the place, and over time, the lack of staff and resources sealed its fate. The hospital closed its doors permanently. The building that had once been a symbol of care and hope was abandoned. Over the years, the place became a ruin. The walls cracked, and nature, as if wanting to reclaim the space, invaded the corridors and rooms with roots and foliage. The story of the cursed hospital began to attract the curious and urban adventurers. Some went driven by the adrenaline of exploring an abandoned building. Others sought evidence of the supernatural. However, not everyone came out unscathed. For some, the experience was just a tour in a deserted and gloomy place, but others came away disturbed. Reports of shadows gliding through corridors, whispered voices, and a disturbing presence that seemed to observe them created a frightening folklore around the place. Over time, the hospital transformed into something to be avoided. Its name became synonymous with horror stories and inexplicable tragedies. It was never clear what evil inhabited its interior, but the legends and testimonies were unanimous in describing it as something horrible, something that escaped any rational explanation. Local authorities tried to demolish the building several times, but inexplicable accidents interrupted the works, and local movements, fueled by legends, fought against its destruction. The hospital remained standing, resisting time and attempts to erase it from collective memory. In its degraded state, it became a sinister memorial to everything it had housed, a permanent reminder of the fear it provoked. Its ruined corridors guard the echo of an evil that was never fully understood, a place where death seemed to lurk, silently waiting for its next victim. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.